Okay. Alana can see sort of like to here, so.
Okay, I'll give my speakers from there, so.
Yeah, everybody should speak for
There
you.
you go.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Here we go.
Is the most recent, like whatever, in the thing, or is it the same?
Yeah, I can send a newer one. There's like, it's highlighted down a little bit. That's pretty much it.
Okay, right.
Turner, will you just let Connolly know if attendance is good or she needs to get?
Oh.
Wait, I don't know that. Oh, got it. Perfect.
Thank you, Judah.
Okay. Is anyone not good?
I'm ready to blow if that's what you need.
The state's demarcation of good and bad development requires the destruction of the environment to secure the material conditions of capitalism, all while waging a constant war against indigenous life. Only redefining what we think is critical infrastructure in the Arctic can allow for us to flip the script of governmentality that requires the erasure of indigeneity to secure the means of production. Red Nation 21. Wet'suwet'en people approach the land and water and animals as different. Our critical infrastructure, the water, the salmon, the berries, the bears, all of that is part of the system that our people depend on, and that whole cycle in the system of our critical infrastructure, that's what we're trying to protect. The cabinet which Bryce and Houston are talking about is built in the exact area where Trans-Canada and Brechin Pacific Trails want to lay pipelines to critical infrastructure. Canada has waged over a decade's worth of violent evictions, demolition, surveillance, and harassment campaigns to guarantee industry and government talk about critical infrastructure, making money and using destructive projects to make that money. The infrastructure we must dismantle are not only manifest in pipelines. The critical infrastructure we must undo is the philosophy that tries to deteriorate conditions. Capitalism destroys life, pollutes rivers, scars, mountain stars, moose, wolves, and salmon, and alienates our bonds with each other in the earth. Its very existence demands our spirits, building alternatives to the death world of capitalism. We have two paths: decolonization or extinction. Indigenous people belong to and love our nation's sovereignty cannot be separated from the health and well-being of the land. Our political orders and systems of governance only matter if we caretake the land. They are intelligible to our relationship with the land. Indigenous land clearing and theft of Inuit land for resource extraction is ongoing in the Arctic. Neocolonialism, born of energy insecurity, driven by geopolitical conflict, believes the Arctic to be the golden sword of energy production, destroying and dispossessing indigenous individuals while accelerating climate change massively. So, 22. Oil and gas extraction demand great control over space. Moreover, like gold, oil and gas and development of reserves is important for states to achieving their political and strategic objectives. The global scenario discovery of oil in regions like northern Alaska and the Arctic has been one of the main drivers of geopolitical interest in the region, with the publication of the resource endowment in the Arctic interest in the economic development of the region, despite 30% of the world's gas and 30% of oil reserves in the Arctic. Activities in the Arctic rely heavily on construction of physical infrastructure and logistic corridors, not only for the direct objective of enabling economic activity, but also to seize strategic advantages given by such points and such connections. The perpetuation of settler colonial logic and development that claim the Arctic as part of their territory comes to the basis of Arctic geopolitics, while economic reasons are an important driver. National security, defense is playing an important part. Such process, military structures seen in Russia, U.S., and Canada encompass all the Inuit homeland. Neo-extractivist capitalist development is characterized by the pressure over natural resource demand for greater capitalist control over space, reinforcing a relationship between humanity and nature based on economic value of land and natural resources. Their objectives are similar to those of old colonialism, consume indigenous territories and the subject activities under the logic of capitalistic accumulation and extend control over populations that inhabit them. Another important aspect of the colonial project is the remodeling of the relation between humanity and nature. Neo-extractivism demand instrumental relation to non-human elements developed under the mediation of value and valorization. This forecloses a range of different social practices. Inuit populations all understand themselves as being stewards of their non-human nature and their homelands and home environments. This is exemplified in the erosion of entire cities in the Alaskan Arctic. Dispossession only fuels further resource extraction, which creates a food feedback loop of destruction. Decolonizing the notion of conversation, therefore, must start from the Arctic. Weez 23. The Arctic environment is irreparably altering due to climate crisis. Indigenous Arctic populations confront homelessness, erosion, or altering the landscape, and forcing migration of entire villages. Homes are disappearing into the eroding shoreline at risk of erosion from sea ice, no longer sheltering the shoreline. Scientists documented failed attempts to try and build lasting seawalls for protection. Will need to relocate to higher ground. The town has already moved several times. Alaskan natives draw from and carry forward a long tradition of multifaceted activism in pursuit of environmental justice. Grassroots organizations continue to center native issues and perspectives on preservation, inextricably intertwined with efforts to sustain forms of indigenous sovereignty that have promoted environmental sustainability and justice activism. Continue to present day with indigenous coordinated organizations that mobilize community empowerment to address the climate crisis from an indigenous perspective. Native movements that provide support for grassroots projects that endeavor to ensure indigenous people's rights in the building of healthy and sustainable communities. The mission is to advance indigenous rights alongside conservation during climate crisis. Conservation is a Western concept, but one approach from a decolonized standpoint, indigenous communities can create better social, environmental, and economic conditions for themselves and support sustainable ecological relationship furthered by indigenous sovereignty. Thus, the United States federal government should significantly increase its development of infrastructure of caretaking in the Arctic through the paradigm of the Red Deal. Normative policy-making frames demarcate different modes of labor as forwards and backwards. Only using a heuristic of development that views caretaking of the land as meaningful allows us to reappropriate infrastructure of capitalism within the Arctic to create a movement for indigenous liberation outside the bounds of the state. Red Nation 21. There's no hope for restoring the planet without indigenous liberation. Indigenous water protectors and land defenders are criminalized and assassinated. We have chosen life and therefore we have been marked for death. Indigenous people continue to caretake the land under the threat of daily attack. Killing the planet is about creating infrastructure of caretaking that will replace infrastructure of capitalism. Caretaking is at the center of indigenous movements for decolonization. We therefore look to these movements for guidance on building infrastructure of caretaking and another current system of global capitalism. Caretaking is unrecognized as a form of labor mutual aid. Right networks populated by caretakers replace the crumbling system of global capitalism. The result of working less solidarity, affirm life by caretaking for humanity rather than denying life by abandoning and exploiting humanity. Affirm your relationship with the land is not optional. This is not some mystical vision where we go out and hug trees. It is a serious agenda for decolonization that requires funding for mass indigenous land restoration projects with threats like radioactive contamination, wildfires, chemical pollution, and biodiversity loss. We need to seek new and alternative technologies. Indigenous people embrace capitalists have a monopoly on technology being used for war efforts. What if technology was created for the benefit of all life on Earth? To answer this question, we must turn to indigenous knowledge. State-centered legal frameworks undergird every action the federal government takes, but are woefully inadequate for understanding the ecological, social, and political transformations unfolding in the Arctic. Scholars should engage in imaginative, future-oriented practices of critical Arctic jurisprudence the Red Deal promotes based off indigenous modes of exploration and world building in order to create a better orientation toward every living and non-living being in the Arctic. Schubart et al. 25. Legal imagination, polar and otherwise, is rather poor to open up. Legal imagination can materialize through a multitude of different epistemic and normative inventions, propose new modes of thinking against normativity. Foreign in the Arctic international law engaged in legal imagination has shaped international norms, transpose their own visions of governance. Legal technicians mapped ideal governance, universalization of a particular approach of legal speculation reflects the imagination of imperial colonial projects. Legal knowledge mirrors the cultural values associated with modernity. Speculative legal practice imagine alternative futures, rethinking legal frameworks themselves through prefiguration, imagining the future we want our legal concepts become more fluid, adaptive, and interconnected, thinking beyond the binaries of state versus non-state actors, utilitarian resource extraction versus environmental protection, to consider normative system that respects indigenous knowledge and the interdependence of all life forms. As we aim to reimagine polar laws in ways not limited to the state modes of existence, we open the register of speculation to a critical turn to polar law to reevaluate assumptions commonly held about the polar regions, to deconstruct existing legal realities such as the premise of conceptual superiority of state sovereignty as the molder of law and life. Poles are portrayed as areas beyond sovereignty where state sovereignties are ontologically reinforced as tools of exclusion, where law freezes yet governance thrives. Speculate a normative future that cares for the human and non-human modes of existence, recognizing the interconnectedness of human and non-human entities to leave behind landlocked, state-bound legal thinking, political and theoretical engagements with governance of polar regions cannot be detached from multiple unfolding planetary crises. Any project towards decolonization must first stem from putting the power to lead and govern in the hands of indigenous people. The adoption of the paradigm of the Red Deal prioritizes an unflinching position towards the end goal of total decolonization, which starts here, Red Nation 21. The Red Deal is new aspirations for justice stem from knowledge is embedded within the land itself. It is argued that indigenous people do not write enough, and when we do, others rarely listen. If humanity were following the guidance for indigenous peoples, we would not have to write yet another program for liberation. The drafting of this text involved hours of meetings with indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island and beyond. Many drafters are not academics, but hold valuable knowledge and skills the Red Deal created through dialogue and action. This is a movement document that comes to inspire our relatives, the humble people of the earth. As much as we hope the Red Deal inspires monumental action, we also hope it inspires more writing and thinking, rigorous engagement with indigenous knowledge that happens in relation to the land. We filter, center, and interpret our politics through a commitment to indigenous political economy and futurity. As the Red Deal continues to be debated, we ask that its intent not be decentered or that it be reduced to cultural or spiritual window for programs designed by white dude experts. Indigenous knowledge is rigorous, scientific, inclusive, diverse, and ever-changing, comprised of indigenous political science that must be at the center of any climate justice program. The methods of revolution aren't anything new. Our program for freedom must be ambitious. There's no reason why indigenous revolutionaries can't lead us. The extent to which the left continues to do so will be the measure of its failure to contribute to the global revolution. The Red Nation is not asking for a seat at the table. It is telling humanity to listen, to take our lead as indigenous knowledge provides models that pose alternatives to mainstream ideas. We have done this before.
Good for context? Okay. What is the Red Deal?
The Red Deal is a platform that encompasses a number of policies. The one I see outlined specifically, the way in which infrastructures of caretaking are developed in the Arctic.
I don't know. The Red Deal is a document produced by an indigenous activist group called the Red Nation. It does not mention the Arctic in it, so I guess my question is...
It is a document which advocates the construction of infrastructures of caretaking.
Does it?
We have,
okay. What is the difference between the Red Deal as a set of policy proposals produced and the paradigm of the Red Deal, which is your plain text?
We think that they are interconnected. We think that the policies we take are inherently a political investment and an investment in an ideology. We think that the movement document, which outlines the ideology of the Red Deal, has a number of chapters advocating for things like infrastructure, transportation, housing, education, all of which are things indigenous populations, especially in the Arctic, are particularly active.
Your evidence says, this is the Red Nation card, says, quote, decolonization or extinction. What is decolonization?
Decolonization is a movement away from colonial systems of power which currently structure much of how indigenous people
Decolonization is a movement away from colonial systems of power. That's fine. This the tag of your true card evidence says state-centered legal frameworks are woefully inadequate. What makes state-centered legal precedent so stellar colonial?
what makes it currently settler colonial. We think that right now it is based in a system of a system of law which is historically colonial and predicated on colonialism, particularly the way in which sovereignty of Western nations is predicated on erasing sovereignty of indigenous people.
Totally agree.
The Shufart evidence continues to outline the way in which speculative legal practice is necessary for undoing that sovereignty.
This evidence says, quote, even scholars whose research involves decolonization frame their arguments through a doctrinal lens to gain legitimacy. How could you possibly achieve decolonization if these scholars advocating for them have to frame demands through that legal precedent that you have identified as fundamentally and irredeemably settler colonial?
Right. The Shufart evidence isolates a difference between that claim of people who are attempting to decolonize through the existing paradigms and also scholars who act through what they call speculative legal jurisprudence, which is an imagination of new ways that is part of the offense in which we say
That's fine. The Red Voices Songs Advocate says, quote, caretakers like parents, land defenders, water protectors produce the means by which we live, yet they are not paid, keeping whole communities afloat. It sounds like parents and water defenders being the caretaking infrastructure that keeps whole communities afloat, unpaid, is a lot of work. How does the plan expand it?
Right. The point is that right now they are not paid or compensated or supported in any of their caretaking efforts. The affirmative provides infrastructure which assists people in
What are you talking about? This plan says those people are the infrastructure. You could not possibly solve that. But I want to say one last thing.
I want to be clear about this. The Red Nation evidence explains the way in which currently water protectors and land defenders are forced to act as infrastructure. The affirmative builds infrastructure which makes their
talk about how important it is to imagine the future you want, which is a line you read in the Shufart evidence. I'm assuming the future you want is the plan. In this future, does the U.S. still exist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. In the future, the decolonial future you want, the U.S. still exists.
Sure.
Yeah. It's not great.
Okay. I have some questions for the group. I want to start on a question in terms of what everybody is doing and how they're doing it. Raise your hand if you flowed the cross-X. Uh-oh. Okay, I have a question for you all. How many of you feel like judges that, are judging you should pay attention to what you say in the cross-X? I am noticing a gap between our theory of debate and how we want to be judged versus our practice of judging and what we are paying attention to. The reason that I start here is I think that this displays a general attitude towards kind of thinking about what the role of cross-X is and whether or not cross-X is important, okay? How many of you think in a debate like this, where we'll talk about some of the concepts that are at stake, but what style of questions were generally asked in this cross-X? Like, is there an underlying theme or kind of like type of question that got asked a lot in this cross-X? Anybody have a, Michael? I agree that there's some built-in premises and arguments going on in the way that the questions are being asked. That's reasonable. That's a feature to keep track of. Okay, so some basic questions about how the affirmative is doing, or how the affirmative is doing what they say should be done. I agree with that.
What the world of the affirmative would look like in the implications of that.
What the AF is trying to achieve. All of this is accurate, but I think that we're missing kind of one of the underlying techniques for asking, the style of question that was being asked in a few different places.
Are they trying to attack a solvency?
Everybody's very focused on the arguments that are being set up, which is reasonable. Okay, so one thing you have noticed and that I would write down, right? Does this cross-X have a plan? Is there some vision for the way that this will impact the future of this debate? Do you think that this set of cross-X questions was thought of in advance? Okay, so cross-X is linked to strategy. We're thinking about the way that answers should influence our strategy.
I also think that the questions are asked in a way to sow distrust in the judges.
Distrust. Okay. How many of the cross-X questions involved issues of definition? A lot. Okay. Definitions of what? What did the cross-X ask the 1A to define?
Infrastructure.
others? Okay, so I have a question for you. Do the two teams define, are they likely by the end of the debate, are we likely to see, like, why ask this set of definitional questions? Why would, because everybody here was focused on the art, like, oh, they disagree. You shouldn't trust the AF, like, okay, we're making arguments. I agree that some of that's going on, but like, why ask any definitional questions?
Maybe it has to do with like for example, sometimes like set call, they're all is like full decolonization, so maybe they're asking about definitions to see how, like if they were to read set call, how the app would differ from like a set call.
Okay, for my own, just because of my like particular, you know, curmudgeonliness or whatever, I would ask that we use full words in our concepts rather than the debate abbreviations. So let's talk about settler colonialism instead of set call for a moment, okay? I don't know if we've, well, we'll get into why, but just like, trust me for a moment that we want to do that. So.
I think also it is in setting up arguments, like I think a lot of debates that center around definitions try to also set up some arguments about who they are. So maybe you're like, thinking about, oh, what these are why for no, this is what for is, this is the government, but this is a good bad debate, things like that.
Okay, I don't think we're gonna see a T argument in this particular demo debate, though you raise a reasonable point. And I think that this actually gets at, it's like, why are we asking about definitions if we don't expect this debate to be about T? Is what I'm trying to get at.
To pin down like what the affirmative actually is.
Okay, so we're establishing like the affirmative, once the affirmative gives some of these definitional style answers, right, it will be very difficult to retract them. So we want to have kind of a real, you know, an idea of what it is that the AF does in order to make sure that we're making our arguments correctly about it.
I think like kind of on the pinning down, like kind of giving like the next ground on like where they can lay their offense safely, but what is certain parts of the AF that we can like actually lay offense on.
Yeah, I agree. So what parts of the AF we could make offensive arguments about? Another way of putting that might be like which parts of the AF we really disagree about. Yeah?
It presumably stops a future permutation because the alternative will be different from the definition always.
What's included and why, right? You might be thinking about competition. Do we think that the negative will disagree, will like say that all of this is undesirable? Like, will the neg say that all of this is wrong?
No.
Okay, so if that's true, why would we want definitions of what these things are?
To like argue no solvency or link it to another K or case term.
All the interrelationships between, right, the affirmative establishes interrelationships between each of these terms, right? That the red deal is a kind of the 1AC defined it, the cross-X defined it as a platform, right, for achieving decolonization that involves building infrastructures of care, and that scholars should engage in speculative jurisprudence in order to do that. So, another thing to notice here, like, did anybody notice anything about the 1AC tags and 1AC delivery? No? Nothing to comment on there?
The tags are very long and descriptive of what the cards implicated for the rest of the AF.
They're pretty dense, right? Now, are they still flowable?
Yes.
Like, do people feel like they flowed these tags reasonably well? So, we can have some dense writing and still make something flowable. What's one of the other things that the 1AC did in order to achieve that? Notice, most of you are not writing down your peers' excellent observations about why people are doing things, so I would consider doing that as well, because it's not just us that you want to write stuff down that we're saying, because everybody's coming up with some good answers to this question. Go ahead. Okay, 1AC very clear. When you have very dense tags, in order for those to be flowable, you've got to make sure that there is some clarity so that people can understand these like more the denseness of these ideas comes through. Yeah? Do we agree that it's fairly high stakes for the AF, that you have a pretty clear understanding of what each of these concepts ought to be? Okay, so because the AF has decided that that is strategically important, they made sure that you could understand that and understand some of the connections between them. When I summarized the connections between these terms, did you think that I got them about right? Like, was I following through on the way that the 1AC related these concepts together? That the Red Deal is a platform for achieving decolonization that involves building infrastructures of care, and speculative jurisprudence is a way to explain what infrastructures of care ought to be built? Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind here then is that the 1AC has thematically tied together a number of key terms and ideas. The cross-ex asked about those key terms and ideas so that we would have a basis going forward for thinking about like which of those we disagree with and which of those we don't, or how they are defined might implicate whether or not we think they are achievable, how they could be achieved, all of those things. So a lot of this cross-ex is actually set up. Like, it's not necessarily all about disagreement and argument. Part of what's going on is just we need to know the terms of our disagreement, and that's an underutilized strategy in cross-ex. Other kind of last questions for folks. What do you think about, like, where do you think the most likely spot of disagreement with the affirmative is in our negative strategy that we're going to demonstrate?
The idea that decolonization involves the existence of the settler state after the win.
Okay, so you think it's between the relationship of these two terms? Is this a way of achieving decolonization / is the AF this? I think that's a reasonable place to settle in on. Another way of thinking about this is the negative strategy has set up that we will need some understanding of each of these components in order to proceed. Okay? Now, flowing the 2AC. Okay, we have a debate now that it's like we've spotlighted for you. This debate will involve one critique. So how are you going to flow that? Everybody's taking out one sheet of paper, that's fine. Do we think that we're going to end up, this was my social agreement, are we going to end up with one sheet of paper's worth of arguments? No. Okay, so gotta have other stuff ready to go. We will see that for the future. Let's hear the 1NC now.
Arguably the most important feature. You will need Turner amounts of paper. However you think that means based on what he just said. And then case. Eyeballs, we good?
Liberalism is cohered through a civilizational imperative where all contestation takes the form of an internal debate over the relative violence of white humanity. This constellation of counterpositions reinvents manifest destiny and weaponizes the fantasy of respectable subjects against anti-civilizational insurgency to secure parameters of deliberation against the end of colonialism, guaranteeing a permanent war against the global majority. That's Rodriguez. And 19, there's no state of exception, just a grinding normal that concedes a reform and demand the refurbishing of the civilizational imperative everywhere, shaping initiatives that re-embody the inheritances of 1619 and manifest destiny, the resilient narrative of national racial progress, our affirmations, the mesh and the coercive promises of suspended futurity of those who fit the civil enemy profile of gendered racial domestic war. The United States is necessarily a theater of racial nation building with facilitating movements of post-civil rights, multiculturalism, resurgent, white nationalism, liberalism, law and order, war dogs, and war on terror. Never separable. There is a deadly coherence crystallizing the counterpositions, redemption, entails conquest, impermanence as the principal term of vision and feeling and subjectivity in the imagination. An economy that pretends that there is a possibility for categorical rather than piecemeal inclusion in this apartheid speciation of humanity. Apprehend the United States in its colonial and chattel formation as an internal debate over the relative violence of white humanity. Accusations of fundamentalism become self-replicating, and the humanitarianism is rejected by the suspicious antagonist of white humanity, screaming universal with the representatives of white humanity extend the helping hand. There must be a state of militant opposition and rejection of the imitation versions of gesture, modernization, interdependence, and citizenship rights. It is already steeped in the common sense
of the myth of access consider reformist demand as a political inheritance of continuity with the limits of internal debate. The states entirely affixed the reorientations of mankind and the transformation of its imagined collective and is remotely capable of altering the perpetual condition of war and conquest, yet there remains a persistent demand that crosses these counterpositions and insistence on becoming tolerated and respected. The terms of internal debate only allow for the gesture of concession of policing, equitability, and reordering of statecraft that affirms tolerance over the lives of those nonetheless endorse other apartheid's winning protective capacity only that it only for now this is a problem mistaken of or misplaced arises the belief in tragic aversion of historical truth that they don't have the right to do that states high ground on the claim that the violence is beyond the right. The grasp of the words will somehow touch the brutalizer's decency claims, dignity, motherhood, queer citizenship will remind them that we are not criminals. The delusion is will for a religious belief. Supremacy must be reiterated, fortified, and violently as white supremacy galvanizes the organizers white publics into the organized fronts. White reconstruction disciplines the formal white supremacist institutions while ensuring that white supremacy that permeates the order of things. The formal elimination of particular forms of racial colonialism are maneuvers of sustainability that absorb anti-racist reform precisely because white beings' ascendancy already assembles the material boundaries and common sense preconceptions of the human. The demand for incorporation of the red deals into the state is a reconciliation that effaces colonialism's violent past while enabling its genocidal present. Dispossession is ongoing and enabled by the AF's liberal guise of recognition that Simpson in 16. Jesus Christ. The language of recognition coupled with the temporality to say that we don't recognize as what is wrong is the performance gesture that is implicitly leaves intact an earlier righteousness at an opening of justice or liberal governance of recognition, apology, inaugurated reconciliation when the past will be reconciled within the present, even if the past remains structured through dispossession, starvation, and death. The techniques of dispossession continue in this modified form. The presumed eventfulness of colonialism that a governance is in order to be able to say that it is over. The colonialism masked by the language of liberalism, rights intends to ongoing colonialism where there is a language and a commitment to multiculturalism. This is a simultaneous commitment to the taking of territory. The body is a side of force that acted upon in order to subdue, subjugate, and is reinstantiated in a physical form. People were living in sub-zero degree temperatures and flooded conditions as the De Beers mine. Heart rate blood diamonds miles away. That was their now murder. Is now physical. The target is the capacity to regulate their own affairs. Citizenship is represented as the right to dispossess. The one is he's called for infrastructures of caretaking is an empty promise that covers over the U.S.'s neocolonial ambitions in the Arctic and elsewhere. That's been in 23. The U.S. Arctic interests have varied when considering Arctic policies, considering the U.S. protectionist agenda. The U.S. is heavily benefited from the Arctic involvement while indigenous peoples do not. The veil is placed over the including and co-managing it is empty. This means is an empty promise, and this conceals the U.S.'s real neocolonialist ambitions towards the Arctic. The continued U.S. interest in the Arctic causes a decrease in security for indigenous peoples in Arctic communities. The U.S. political actors discourse that suggests that the Arctic inhabitants were prioritized, yet its investment projects such as the Willow Project home management and consideration of the Arctic inhabitants was not exercised on an international scale. The rhetorical versus the underlying meanings of the discourse shape Arctic nations as the U.S. is more interested in protecting its own Arctic inhabitants. The U.S. acknowledges the concerns of Arctic inhabitants, but they do not prioritize or follow through as the U.S. continues to enter the Greenlandic indirectly through neocolonialist backdooring. The veil is helping and cooperating as a tactic to protect the U.S. reputation, presence, and future in the Arctic. The one is claim that indigenous caretakers is holding natural knowledge of the climate must that might save the world perfects the colonial narrative of the ecological Indian stereotype turns the case and justifies colonial violence as anchor. In 20, the one-dimensional stereotype quoted here is the ecological Indian can be disempowering. Even the romanticization of indigeneity that the inhabitants of the New World have no trace in their environment was in some hands used to conclude that they have no rights to the land. NGOs generated narratives of indigenous knowledge embellishing the ethnographic sources. The ecological Indian is a political image that becomes impossible ideal against the indigenous peoples are judged other than corrupted and inauthentic. Thus, in cases where indigenous people have come into conflict of the environmentalists that Michael Will hunted and dispute over sealing high-profile examples, those opposing them to decry loss of culture, flip the stereotype to characterize indigenous culture as harmful. What persists is the story of indigenous peoples having lost their ecological purity or found a conservative ethic in the myth of timeless pre-political state of nature. Vote negative to refuse the invitation of the internal debate when the representatives of colonial humanity extend a helping hand. Refusal takes a stake to claim a militant opposition, opening ways to organize life and politics outside of the internal debate's colonial imperatives. That's Lindroth. In 14, adaptation takes place on the other team on other terms leads to the death of the ideal resilient indigenous subjects that sustains a particular kind of indigeneity that fits expectations of the being adaptive caretaking and does not recognize those ways of being that do not exhibit the expected essentialized features that is something extra that exceeds the frame of resilient indigeneity. This would indicate a crack in the care and signal resilient resistance engaging the radical gamble as a refusal. This involves many gains and losses impossible accessible for him. The refusal to entertain the loving concern that biopower occasions the refusal of its care is resistance international politics. For example, the Arctic Council, the prime ways of care manifest the call for the indigenous agency to be indifferent to this call and thus reject the demand of resilient indigeneity could be moving away from the state affirmation and structures of the colonizers. The role of global caretaker assigned to the indigenous people marks peoples as responsible for the future to move away from one-sided perception of caring for nature to resist the biopower that seeks to cast it as such. Case Trump will roll back the plan. 1, DEI bans means infrastructures of caretaking can't be in alignment with the red deal or else it's totally unenforceable. 2, vagueness. Caretaking infrastructures are at least in part of immaterial socially reproductive labor means Trump cancels every other part of the plan, leaving indigenous communities high and dry. Affirmative ethics of care relies on hierarchy between those who extend care and those who receive it. This distinction reproduces neoliberal anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity because of its parasitic upon a separation between those who have the capacity to care and those who do not. That's Beasley and Bocce. And 7, care ethics describe the ability to care as a moral attribute. The hierarchical nature of mothering, caring, and relationships go unnoticed as an asymmetrical relationship is a contraction between those needing care and those delivering care. Care focus on responsibility, responsiveness, and compassion for the other precisely replicates the compassionate acts of care ethics, reinstating asymmetry of the core of the relationship and the potential connections between the care and the power, such as an ethical starting point reinstates hierarchy and undermines the egalitarian relations. Its difficulty regarding hierarchy is present in all incarnations of vocabularies of stressing altruism. Circumvention. The plan's totally unenforceable. 1, legal position. Its alignment with the red deal means nothing. It will be entirely ignored. 2, corporations. They famously hate attempts to end capitalism. Wow, they'll do everything they can to sabotage, roll out caretaking infrastructures, or simply co-opt them. 3, scope. There's a lot of different indigenous communities in the Arctic. They can only fiat things within the U.S.'s jurisdiction, especially since they said the U.S. will remain existent post-plan, which means colonial power simply will just move there. Hello?
What do you mean 2?
I'm ready.
Oh.
Are you there?
Creates a hierarchy of people and care.
I want to start on the Rodriguez evidence. It isolates the internal debate as related to colonialism. What is the internal debate?
It is the debate or the dialogue between, liberalism, the conservatism. It's the question of should we reform, shan't we reform?
How do you distinguish between what is internal versus external?
Based on my answer to that question, I'm not really sure what you're asking.
Like, is there anything that falls outside of the frame of colonialism, capitalism, conservatism, etc., per the Rodriguez evidence?
1, if there is, which I do think that our alternative isolates that there is probably something outside of those things, it's the something that cannot be grasped. That is not something that can be accessed through or via the 1AC because of the way that you have limited it within that internal debate. So there is nothing that the 1AC produces that is outside of that, which is why I gave the first answer that I gave. If the judges here have a desire to understand what that could be, should be, outside of the debate, the only way for them to vote is negative.
So maybe a better question is, how do you determine whether something is a part of the internal debate?
Well, in this particular context, the links.
The links, okay.
You saying the U.S. will still exist post-plan, we've also identified that as a way to determine if it's internal or external.
Okay, so then is there ever a redeemable example of state action or no?
What is redeemable? I don't know what that word
Is there ever an example of state action that would not fall within the internal debate?
Given that the state is created and reproduced in liberalism, no.
Okay. The Simpson evidence.
Through liberalism, yeah.
The Simpson evidence isolates recognition politics and an ethos of multicultural recognition as related to colonialism. Is there ever a positive form of recognition, or is there ever a call for recognition by indigenous people that we should honor?
I think that burden to outline or isolate a positive form of recognition is probably more of a burden for the affirmative than the negative.
Okay, maybe a better question is when you have groups like the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, for example, at the Dakota Access Pipeline, who are engaged in forms of multicultural organizing and opposing fossil fuel industries that are being built on their land, that is a call, at least the affirmative would think, as a multicultural recognition. Should the state honor that? Should anyone honor that? How do you honor that without?
I hear what you're saying, and but the problem with that is that even if they are calling for a form of recognition from the state, which arguably not sure that that's what's happening there, but even if that is the case, it does not change the fact that through liberal recognition politics, that there is something that the state can garner from that. So even if they did respond to that call, the only thing the state could respond with is within the internal debate of reform versus not reform, which means that they would never actually be able to answer or give those communities what they want.
This is why I just want to add to her answer. This is like why Obama took the side of those anti-pipeline activists to justify being like, well, if we didn't, it would hurt the U.S.'s climate credibility globally.
Right, I understand that's what happens historically. I'm asking why is it not desirable to do the opposite of that?
What? I don't understand. Like,
this is yours.
Okay. Do we flow the cross-X this time? Yes. Good. Remember that, because a lot of the debate may come down to disagreements and definitions and kind of understandings of some of these core concepts. Do we see why, as a judge, it would be very helpful / maybe necessary to look back at how each of the teams responded to some of these defining these core underlying concepts or explaining their significance. So that was part of the reason to push you all to do that. Now I want to talk about, did we notice, so does this cross-X share some similar features to the cross-X of the 1AC? Like, are some of the cross-X questions being asked in the same way? So, getting some nods. Okay, so what does that mean, or like what did you notice about, we'll kind of do this as a way of helping us to understand the 1NC as well, okay? So, first cross-X question, what is it?
What is the internal debate?
This is from the 1NC Rodriguez evidence. I'm putting that in quotes there just to indicate that this is directly from the evidence, okay? So, how is this question answered? What do we understand about this concept?
Everything falls within the paradigm of like liberal reform versus like acting in opposition to it, and that the only way outside that is to bring the project to negative and active colonization versus the idea that the 1AC cannot be separated from that physical aspect.
Great answer. You're paying really good attention. So, liberal reform versus conservative opposition to those reforms, that is defined in this debate as an internal debate. Internal to what?
The state.
I think that you're on the right track. Can you add a little bit there or like provide a little more detail?
Do you like look in neoliberalism or like the model that uses to
I'm going to push back a tiny bit on neoliberalism. It's not that this concept is not mentioned at all by the 1NC, but I don't think it's foregrounded by the 1NC, right? And like, if these are the polls that we're talking about, like, you said state, like internal to, so what are we really talking about internal to, or just like, why would this be internal to, you said the state, so let's add some details to this. Why refer to that as internal to what? What's really going on here?
Is it internal to the sort of like paradigm of settler colonialism and like those ideas writ large? Like that system?
I don't think Rodriguez is referring only to settler colonialism, but within colonial societies, okay? And do we hear, like, I actually think that if you were listening to the internal components of these of these longer cards, first of all, do we notice, like, did anybody write down the wording in the cards as they were being spoken? Okay, a couple people are nodding their heads. I would encourage you as if you were thinking about what you want your judges to do or to like actively listen, don't you think they would be listening to the evidence? Okay, so let's think a little bit about what some of the evidence says. So what does the evidence say like if we say internal to what did the evidence say? Because I think that the evidence defined this internal debate. Note, the 1NC evidence included a lot of complete sentences. So we gotta understand some of these core concepts. That seems like that would be helpful. So I'm glad that we did that. Internal to what? Did we hear that sentence? Yeah.
I have like white nationalism and racial colonial institutions. That's some of the things that were. I don't remember what.
You're so close. Azja, as the one end, do you mind filling us in on that internal debate? Internal to, and then I think there's a line that says what it is internal to.
Damn it, Turner, putting it on the spot. Apprehend the United States in its colonial and chattel formation, this part, an internal debate over the relative violence, vulgarity, sophistication, and political capaciousness of white humanity. Capaciousness.
Okay. So, an internal debate over relative violence and or capaciousness, and a couple other terms there, civility, I think, of white humanity. So, why put violence here? Why relative violence? What is that referring to? use the word relative. When something is a relative measure, what does that mean? What's the, yeah.
It's like in relation to or in comparison to something.
Aha. In comparison or relation. So there's got to be a baseline, yeah? What is the baseline here? Okay, so the historical argument then is about, it is about the relative violence of colonial society, as in that is accepted as the baseline. Okay, so do we get that? It's like we are determining to what degree is this an example of violent colonialism, okay? Not, is there something beyond it? Okay, this was, I think, gets at some of the other questions about what would be outside of this kind of internal debate. But do we see that it's like, that is relative to the assumption that this is the society in which we live, and that remains the baseline against which all things are judged. So that's the internal component of this, okay? Capaciousness of white humanity. What's capaciousness? Can somebody give me, we're helping you out with your SATs as well here this morning. What's capaciousness? So it's an adjective. So what are we?
Capacity or size or scope.
Capacity, size, or scope. So the ability, the extent of, right? Or kind of ability to have or extent of, scope, limits, etc. So if we were having a debate over the capaciousness of white humanity, what are we debating, according to Rodriguez?
Scope of the violence.
That was this. That's a good point, but that's that. Right? That's the how violent is our society being? It's if we accept, notice, the baseline here is the violence of colonialism, and then the internal debate is how relatively violent or because, okay, for liberal reformists, why would they call some of the actions of the state violent? Can somebody give me an example of a liberal reformer who calls parts of what the state does violent? Apparently, we also need to help you with your U.S. history class. Give me. You've been pulling the group along, so we're going to return to you, but I want to hear from some other folks here. Note, if we cannot think of an example of this, it will be fairly difficult to talk about either side of this position. So I want to hear somebody who is a liberal reformer, okay, who makes an argument about the relative violence of our society. Ben.
AOC or Zoran Valley.
Okay, give me an example for why are we defining AOC as a liberal?
AOC's for this definition says that there were specific reforms the state should do to account for violence, specifically against immigrants, racial minorities, gender minorities, etc.
Okay, so existing U.S. immigration policy is violent because we are deporting people, we are depriving them of certain rights that are found in our society. Do we agree with that as kind of that is an example of a reformist position with regards to immigration law? Do we see how it says part of immigration law is currently violent? As in, shouldn't do family separation, shouldn't, hold people in alligator Alcatraz, right? All of these are examples of calling the actions of our society violent, saying that they are relatively violent with regards to the baseline of, so now the example is the reform, right? If we enforced rights, the rights that rights holders have with regards to their immigration status or belonging, okay, that would be less violence. Do we get this kind of full example here now? Okay, why is that a debate about the capaciousness of humanity as well? Sorry, so one example is that it is an example of a debate about violence. So that's the should immigrants be detained? What are the conditions of detention, etc. would be an example of a debate about violence. Somebody now give me an example of a debate about capaciousness. What can white humanity contain? How many of you have heard the concept in your history class that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants? Raise your hand. Can we connect the dots on why that might be a claim about the capaciousness of humanity?
Whether there's a line that you can draw between who's an acceptable immigrant and therefore assimilated, what humanity is unacceptable.
Do the folks discussing this on the side of liberal immigration policy tend to say the key thing that we're doing here is drawing a line between acceptable humans and unacceptable humans? Like, to use our AOC example, if you listen to an AOC speech, does it start with, our core task today is to define the limit between acceptable and unacceptable humans? Well, okay, yeah, I'm not mocking your answer. I'm trying to draw out the, like, we skipped a step, okay? We skipped a step. We kind of agreed with the neg argument here already, which is okay, but I want to do the in-between step here. Why does the liberal reformer use the language of, like, we're drawing a line in the sand here? Is that the common piece of rhetoric?
Like drawing, keeping people in, I guess, from being.
Yeah, right. It's like the argument here is, we can welcome many people as Americans. Like, America is a nation of immigrants. We could welcome so many people in. They add to the richness and wealth and diversity of our society. Like, how many people think that sounds a little bit more like a speech that you might hear at the DNC or maybe from AOC? Does that sound somewhat familiar? Okay, meaning that's a debate about how big this category could get. It's capaciousness. Can we recognize that other people deserve empathy despite the fact that they are coming from a different place or speak a language that is not our own, right? All of those are arguments to some degree, or could be characterized, they are being characterized by the negative, as debates about capaciousness. What is the capacity of this category, humanity? Because in order to, if you're going to have rights as an immigrant, what do you have to be?
Is that where the modifier of white humanity comes in?
Aha, okay. This concept is being modified. So you've got to be a human, and once again, in terms of this like relative versus absolute, why does Rodriguez include white humanity as the modifier?
That's where typically the line is drawn between what can be drawn and accepted and what is seen as other and leads to the relative violence against.
This is an argument in some ways that no matter how big this category gets, it is still informed by this term. You see that, right? Same thing with the like, no matter how much you say the relative violence of this society should decrease, you are using the baseline of it is a society that ought to exist. What cross-ex answer in both of the first two cross-exes dealt with that issue of no matter what the relative violence of the society's choices are, you have said that it ought to, you have accepted the baseline that it ought to exist.
The existence of the U.S. government closely.
Okay. Are the terms of this debate becoming a little bit clearer? I would suggest that this is one of the examples of just like, if some of this feels unfamiliar or you're like, I don't really read this argument all that much, sometimes it is frustrating to give cross-exes in this way, like, do we see how trying to unpack some of these cards and like understand the terms, it can help us like really understand what it is that we're arguing about. So we've got some more clues about the negative argument here. I have a question then about the red deal. Does the 1NC take a position with regards to the red deal? What is it?
That's the attempt to integrate the stance the regulations of the state which is inherently oppositional to it, because it modifies this demand for colonization by putting centric indigenous sovereignty and modifying that into legal framework to complement that.
Is this an example of saying that the red deal is bad?
No.
Okay. Why this word integrate? Okay, so integrate, that matches the language of, we'll make it part of the internal debate. We will debate the red deal as though it is an example of reform. That's the negatives accusation, yeah? Do we get that? That's why they use the language of integrate rather than red deal, reject the red deal, okay? Decolonization. Can anybody identify broadly, thematically, the 1NC position on decolonization?
Like it would be prevented, like by like corporations or like the state itself.
Okay. How would the negative define? Like, can we give, in terms of some of what we've got already, what would decolonization entail?
Decolonization is not something that can be done through existing states or through the order of white humanity. Instead, it should be done outside of that, as an external.
Cannot be conceptualized in the terms of internal debate. Okay? Infrastructures of care. What language in the 1NC appears about infrastructures of care?
That it was an empty promise that covers like actual decolonization.
Is that an argument that infrastructures of care are bad or undesirable?
No.
No. Okay. Do we see, it's like, now, state-centered versus speculative, or it's like speculative jurisprudence. What does the neg have to say about this? Very similar in my eyes, that the false promise component here is like, if you put these two things together, okay, you end up over here. Okay, because this is ultimately an argument that centers, remember what was the cross-ex, what word in Spencer's cross-ex of the 1NC was used to set up this argument about state-centered versus speculative jurisprudence? Anybody remember?
If the U.S. still exists.
Yeah, and the word I was looking for there was doctrinal, right? Went into this evidence and said, this evidence says that if our debates continue along doctrinal lines, what's a doctrine? What would doctrine be connected to in law? Is a doctrine a specific law? What is it instead? Okay, so we often encounter the word doctrine in foreign policy. Give me an example of a doctrine in foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine, right? The U.S. will not accept, quote, interference in the Western Hemisphere by non-Western Hemispheric powers. You see how that's a broad principle, yeah? So in a legal context, you might think of that as it embodies a broad principle rather than a specific law. So here, if we continue to accept the idea that we are debating within the broad existing legal principles, we're back here again. Do we see how this is a key term for organizing a whole bunch of the negatives arguments then, is this internal debate thing. Okay, last point that I'll make before the 2AC. One of the things that I really liked about the cross-ex of this 1NC is that there was a question that we didn't hear that I suspect that all of you would have asked. What's the first question that you all love to ask when you hear a critique? What does the world of the alternative look like? Okay? Why didn't we hear that? You're like, I don't understand. I asked that question of every critique. They didn't even ask, like, oh my God, the AF must be doomed. They didn't ask the single most important question. No, I do not think the AF is doomed, and I don't think that's the most important question. What did they do instead? Did the AF ask any cross-ex questions about the alternative? Please note, I'm trying to phrase some of these things as broad, like I am phrasing some of my things in doctrinal terms, as in here is a template that you might be thinking, because I'm guessing that most of you don't love cross-exing a critical 1NC. Because I see you ask the same question 7 times in a row, which is what does the world of the alternative look like, and then nobody talks about it ever again. So let's try and do that a little bit differently. What did this cross-ex do differently? We're hearing from the same people over and over again, so maybe somebody who hasn't spoken yet reach out there and try and grab this one. Yeah. Okay, so for one, there was a question about recognition, right? It's like, how do we know, and how is that question asked? How do we know something, whether or not something is part of the internal debate, was the question that I heard. As in, how do we identify the scope of this accusation or like link argument about what is the internal debate? So that was one, because we want to know a lot about that given how important that concept seems to be. There's another cross-ex question that is about the alternative that I think people are missing.
The question's about whether or not there's an outside to the internal debate.
Okay.
Or there's the optical.
Okay, I agree that is a question about the alternative. Can you get to a specific example, like that question was asked, where did that chain go? Where did we end up? You're anticipating some of the setup, which I think is good, but like, where did that chain of questions end up?
I think they're scoping out if any like redeeming state action is possible.
Aha, okay, so, notice, instead of asking the question, what does the world of the alternative look like, the AF asked a question about the negative alternative in terms of their link and their impact, not just the AF impact, okay? So most of you asked the question, what does the world of the alternative look like? Because you are asking about, does the alternative solve the case impact? That is ultimately, I believe, what you are trying to ask. Yeah? Do we agree with that? Okay. What is different about asking the neg a cross-ex question about their link or their impact in terms of their alternative? What does that do?
It allows them to explain it more, and they probably get away with that articulation because they didn't get to do it in the speech itself.
Yeah, so we get a little bit more, like we get a little bit of specificity. I think that's good. What else is this doing? Okay, well, let's make a note of this because I think this will come up. Did the neg have to answer a question that is going to be important about what the alternative can and can't do? Is it important that the alternative cannot, like, I'm sure everybody thought it was very important that the neg cross-exed about the existence of the United States. Yeah? Okay. Could it simultaneously be important that the AF is asking questions about whether or not the alternative could include the state doing stuff? Okay, so that's what I was trying to get at, is like by asking the question in terms of the negative's link argument, that AF got a faster answer about what could or couldn't be included in the alternative. That seems like a handy tool. And yet almost no one has written it down as a principle of cross-execution. Well, in the interlab debate, some of you will be hearing from me again about your cross-ex strategies. Okay, we'll hear the 2AC now. We should have multiple pieces of paper out.
Yes!
How many arguments on the side of a sheet of paper? 4 to 5. Okay, great. Give it a try. If you've never done it before, I promise. It will yield some interesting results.
I didn't know that you had a number.
Like 4 to 5 cards?
No, like 4 to 5 arguments.
Okay. No, that's fair. I didn't know that is the number you usually.
I promise it's not too much space.
Alright, it'll be case and then the case.
Sorry, I almost violated my own rule.
Yeah, if this one's framework, that's really the fun thing close to it.
What did the 2 ACs tell us to do? Okay, I got a question down here. It's like, are you flowing framework on the same piece of paper as the rest of the kit? Okay. I would note, okay, as a judge, I would expect to receive any instructions about how to flow from the person giving the speech in their roadmap. So if Ilan wanted a separate piece of paper for a specific argument, Ilan should tell me that. Ilan, do you want me to add a specific piece of paper for a specific 2AC argument?
No.
Okay. So we're not doing that. Just want to point that out. It's like, if you've got any questions about this, you as the debater, you have the ability to explain what you think should be done. So take it away.
Anyone awkward?
The plan solves the terminal impact to all the links and implements a red deal advocated by coalitions of indigenous activists that see state power and redistribute it for indigenous good. This is a material, broad movement that connects local struggles to broader anti-capitalist and anti-colonial movements. The AF's harm reduction materially reduces the harms of climate change and fascism that indigenous communities face and actualizes radical energy and potential for decolonization. Rollback is wrong. If the DEI ban prevents the AF, obviously durable fiat overturns it. Anything else makes it impossible to be AF because anything can be construed as violating it. Vagueness does not make sense, and durable fiat means Trump cannot cancel the plan. The KRK, no link. The 1EC has not prescribed an ethic of mothering or asymmetric and hierarchical relationships. There's no warrant for why our specific defense of care devolves into the anti-black systems that they have delineated. Care can take different forms. Their understanding of care is essentializing and ignores the way different communities deploy ethics of care. The 1EC has defended specific instances of indigenous people caring for each other, the environment, and the planet, which they have made specific demands for. We are not coercing any form of care to take place, but rather providing the infrastructure necessary to complete it. Care is good in the context of the AF. The 1EC has subsumed their critique of it. It allows a shift away from capitalism and for indigenous liberation movements to flourish. That's Red Nation. Circumvention is wrong. Normal means implementation solves legal precision. Obviously, no plan exactly delineates the bill to be passed. The plan fiats the paradigm of the red deal to which policymakers would obviously look for clarification. There's no warrant for corporations cracking down. Make them read a card. If it's true, it's not unique to the AF. And normal means will protect the infrastructure. They have not read say no, so assume other countries say yes. The U.S. can still provide infrastructure and funding. That's the Red Nation card. The K. Framework, evaluate the material consequences of the plan and the political project of the Red Deal. Those cannot be disentangled. Both should be sources of AF offense, but are open to critique. Prefer it. Unpredictable critiques decimate fairness and clash because the AF can never garner offense. Project floating pics minimizes AF offense and makes reading 99% of the 1EC useless. Sex education, private actor, and international fiat are voters. There are billions of possible actors. Justifies object fiat and obliterates both fairness and clash. Now, framing issue for the links is that one, they're either non-unique or inevitable. State power exists in the status quo, and there are other settler institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Second is that the AF does not run contrary to the alt. It only codifies indigenous demands of the status quo. Thus, permutations do both. Vote AF and refuse the invitation to the internal debate. Either the alt can overcome the link to the AF or it cannot overcome the link to the status quo. We should not refuse all instances of indigenous nationalism. Doing both solves our offense. Carlson, 18, tension between ethics and politics and necessary rhetorically indigenous nationalism is equal. No question to the source to know when to engage suspensions, when to form resolutely refusal. Constitute therein deploys a strategy for creating the conditions of rupture and settlement normativity. Decolonization projects not simply anti-settler colonialism. Both presuppose each other and should be developed together as a project of decoloniality. Censoring the demands of the Red Deal is necessary to avoid crowding out indigenous thought. That's the Red Nation evidence. Permutation to the alt, either it results in the Red Deal or cases a DA. Permutation to the plan and the parts of the alt that solve the impact of the links. It's the best of both worlds. Now, the internal debate thesis is wrong. One, no warrant for supremacist institutions absorbing our reform. Rodriguez flattens all indigenous resistance into liberal reform, ignoring specific demands they have made on the state, which proves their theory cannot adequately account for native existence. Second, Rodriguez agrees reform is possible and votes AF. We are an abolitionist approach. Rodriguez 20. Some reform campaigns take institutional adjustments that address racial colonial violence. Abolitionist approaches defend vulnerable and oppressed people while allowing activists to overturn and transform arrangements, defunding police budgets, decriminalizing economies, decarceration, and universal housing. Build a society without police or prisons where communities are equipped for safety and well-being. Third, the AF is actualizable. There is no scarcity of resources. Red Nation 21. The Red Deal call for divestment in carceral institutions. Military spending accounted for 54% of the U.S. government spent cut spending on education, healthcare, food stamps, and other crucial services to inflating military spending, bail out banks and subsidize false inclusive farm divesting from the U.S. military, connect child hunger, homelessness, and fund renewable energy on a global scale. Tomorrow, there's not a scarcity of resources. We must simply redistribute them to the people. 4. Only a project of actively building decolonial infrastructure can resolve the toxicity of colonial geographies. La Duque and Co. in 20. We are close to ecological collapse. Indigenous bearing the brunt of toxicity crisis result in accumulation, dispossession. Despite severity, the future is not foreclosed. Choosing a good path requires infrastructure not inherently colonial. It is essential for transformation. A pipe can carry fresh water as well as toxic sludge. Effective initiatives to decolonization must center infrastructure that is life-giving, design, finance, drawing on community, city, streets, and futures, thinking of building beyond window infrastructure, essential architecture of decolonized futures. Simpson argues techniques of dispossession continues in different forms. That is wrong. Their rhetoric of, quote, ongoing dispossession has a narrative deficit. It makes indigenous liberation impossible by setting terms of victory as all or nothing, reifies acquiescence to settler powers. Busbridge 18. There is a narrative deficit when imagining decolonization. The structural paradigm closest down political transformation to which decolonization aspires and seeks to elucidate the logic of elimination as overarching guiding settler and native relations. There is a weakness in where the logic is omnipresent even when it appears not to be there's an ontological dimension where the settler will that is inherently destroys the elimination of the native only perspective does not offer hopeful future. Settler colonialism has one story, the total victory of fatalism has come into greedy for redefining settler colonialism meta structure where relations are inevitable, not only is ontology, race, contingency, and images, politics, justice, justice, where any discussion where it's not this polarity, submission, and settle, leaving the only non-existent relations with these all crazy, this lies, the current publics, and council resistance, acquiescence, all made Muslim struggle, but from state different opposition, Nazi colonization, settler political grammars can be tactically repurposed. For us now 19, focusing on radical ontological difference lead to romanticized reification and difference in nature, ignoring actual demands on the ground. Those might emerge out of indigenous modernity. Some indigenous people formulated hegemonic vision and use modern nations such as citizenship rather than rejecting irreconcilable aiming to make generic conclusions as real life consequences related to the problem when knowledge is produced in Western academy. Knowledge that is abstract applicable beyond a specific context. The infrastructure of caretaking link is wrong. Fenn assumes the United States seizes control over the Arctic and makes empty promises with the plans. Mass indigenous socialist movements wrestle the state away from settler colonialism, and indigenous demands for wealth redistribution, land back, healthcare, and universal housing should be fulfilled. These can rally large-scale anti-capitalist and anti-settler colonial movements to prevent violence, and we will impact from the link. Caretaking is an ethical obligation to avoid planetary collapse. Al-Chami 24. Caretaking economy imperative to confront capitalism, protect health of people, land resources, health workers, and activists. Alternate power to militant people who enforce violence, degradation. Caretaking is demilitarized, non-violent divestment of colonial structures necessary for caretaking that heals human and non-human worlds. And healing body can take place by divesting, reinvesting, supporting caretaking involves advocating activism for resources, support, housing, education, healthcare, restoration, and violence. Caretaking is integral to healing human life, restore health to the planet, regenerate balance. The earth belongs to all beings. Caretaking is an ethical obligation. Reinvesting to green economy as part of caretaking requires liberation and restoration that has been devastated. The ecological Indian link could not be more wrong. The Red Deal resists these stereotypes. It does not romanticize indigenous people as passive environmental stewards, but asserts them as political agents building alternative futures. The Al-Chami evidence above reaffirms indigenous knowledge as living science for survival and decolonial governance. The AF rejects both settler extraction and liberal fetishization. The AF is a project of agnostic decolonization, or agonistic decolonization, which returns stewardship over land to indigenous people. Madison 22, Agonistic decolonization must involve material structural change in the relations between indigenous people and the state supposed by radical intervention, political institutions. Discourse can only address decolonization. Metaphoric agonism is material structural tendencies to radical reform to liberate them in the low level of democratic institutions, including land tenure. Decolonization must be more than the emphasis taken by settler Muslims attempt to release settler responsibility without giving up land and promote debate on view of reconciliation as educated strategy. Settler does not attend radically enough to the underlying structural fabric of the settler colonial societies. Now, the alternative is bad. 1. Zero mechanism. They never explain how the alt dismantles material settler infrastructures or halts Arctic extraction. It devolves into endless refusal with no possibility for indigenous futurity. Second, cases at DA saying reject does not stop extraction without rebuilding caretaking systems. Indigenous life still gets erased by climate and capital. Third, Red Deal solves better. The plan already rejects the state's colonial logic, but pairs that with a material strategy of indigenous-led infrastructure and mutual aid. 4, rejection stifles indigenous activism that exists already. Lightfoot 20, the state is unchanging in its desire to assess this plan is limited agency, overlooking reality. The organizations that directed shifting savings, pesticides, and trust, and indigenous engagement, reimagined relations, overemphasizing structure can prevent the state agency as unitary action does not disservice to resistance by prescribing a narrative without self-determination between indigenous people could be political action, condemning all people that say states out of step. With many movements working for decades, by declarations ground being given the peoples and indigenous people negotiating agreement with states are not going to implement changes on their own central power political will is missing. Engagement with states creates division amongst movements who should be pooling resources and working together. 5, investing directly into indigenous communities is necessary. Parity 21, settler colonialism through cultural genocide and racist attitudes have been formalized and law and assimilated within institutions. This will only be balanced when funding is given directly to indigenous communities to conduct work as they see fit, partnering with whom they choose and addressing what is relevant to their own community. Applying indigenous methodologies as primary methods of working as opposed to considering them as add-ons is an important step. 1, remains accountable to that knowledge rather than extracts or owns it. Sources of that knowledge need to be the right of consent. 6, settler inaction is not ethical or nor positive. Settlers ought follow the lead of indigenous people to demand specific material solutions that elicit real gains. Mills 19, a starting point that will lead to accept settler status as settler second step to question everything condition as mutual about liberal legality. A person settler should deploy their privileges in the interest of indigenous people and identifying exclusions and demanding they be addressed, confronting incidents of settler supremacy, insisting on education about colonialism and militating for dedicated healing and cultural programming. Settlers should insist indigenous issues impact all of us. Settlers afraid of overstepping should note that for anti-colonial labor, settlers have not only capacity but also responsibility to act work. Less in the abstract that systemic change contemplates, and more immediately if you're a settler who refuses change, you've missed the point.
Okay. Oh, process.
Okay. Okay. What is a private actor?
We think private actors are like non-governmental actors.
Got it. What is the internal link between deliberating over the AF and its actualization? So how does discussing, dialoguing about the ethical obligations of, indigenous resistance here result in things like defunding the police?
I mean, we
and
don't think
getting
that our
rid of-
literal reading of the affirmative leads to like the police being defunded and the military being defunded, etc. Those are things that are all advocated by our sovereignty advocates, which we defend. But we think like the reading of the OIC is still a useful thought experiment to engage in. Obviously, no one believes the plan actually happens because like fiat is like a pessimistic way of viewing the world and says that the United States.
Okay,
needs to
fiat is a
change.
pessimistic way of viewing the world. Just everyone write that down. Turner said take notes. Turner said take notes.
Well, yes.
Moving on.
because it says
What
that
does
something is wrong
what
with
does
the
it
world now that
mean?
needs to be
What does it
improved, and we
mean?
provided
What does it
methods to
mean
improve.
for the Arctic, or what is the alternative form of care that 1AC has outlined or provided?
I mean, it's not that we've provided like an alternative form of care, like we've defended the caretaking systems that indigenous communities want to engage in.
What
and
are
status
they?
quo that they're calling for. Sure, the Al-Chami card that I read under the Fen link talks about how indigenous people are calling for infrastructure for health workers, activists, caring for like the environment, caring for each other, creating infrastructure to heal human life, restore the health of the planet, regenerate balance, etc.
Okay, sure. So I guess my question then becomes, right, what does it mean for the US, your actor that is private, okay, to invest in those projects? Like, so how do you balance like Arctic indigenous control and the US being the thing that has to invest and like give energy to
I
that?
mean, we've made arguments about how they lack infrastructure and they lack funding in the status quo. The plan would mandate that the United States like builds that infrastructure and provides the funding so that they are able to most like effectively engage in these caretaking systems, which they very much want to do.
Got it. My next question is, what is a material strategy? You've said multiple times that the app is material. What does that mean?
Right. I mean, I think we're making like a contradiction between the app and the alternative.
I agree that you're
posited
contradicting yourself. I
Well, no.
want to know what about that is.
You posited that the alternative is simply like a refusal. We think material action to
And
improve
that,
conditions is
so
necessary.
you've not answered my question. You've only proved my point further. What is the difference between refusal and material? And I need to understand what the definition
Well,
of
I mean,
material is
you
to
all-
understand why refusal is not that. So
You
what
all
does
have
it
not like
mean?
explicitly like explained what refusal means, but our argument is that in the context of the affirmative is a material action.
What is
i.e.
material?
Yes, i.e. materially building infrastructure, materially providing funding.
But you
etc.
said that this is a discussion, that
What do you mean
like,
a
that
discussion?
you said that the app is a thought project, so I'm trying to understand why the app is somehow more material.
Okay, if you're gonna go for the fiat K, then we will have that debate. We think that the fiat implications of the affirmative is materially helping the conditions for indigenous people.
I mean, fair enough, I guess.
Okay. Got some questions about UAC strategy. So first of all, roughly how many arguments did the 2AC contain?
A million.
24.
I had 22. We numbered a couple of them a little differently. Okay? Do we see why? So now, I have a question. Are many of these arguments about, like, do they take the terms of the debate that we kind of laid out in terms of the cross-X and the 1NC shell, are most of the 2AC arguments related to some of those terms? Okay. So, despite the fact that this debate is very broad in terms of like number of arguments, you know, like there are a lot of cards being read, right? Like it's relatively dense in the sense that, do we agree that most of the core areas of disagreement that the AF and the NEG have, like most of the clash in this debate, is already up on the board? Like, did the 2AC introduce a whole lot of new terms or like concepts to what clash is about? Some folks are shaking their heads. So this is, in some ways, do we now see that it's like the structure of this debate is a very dense debate about the way in which the AF and the NEG kind of treat and consider some of the core aspects that we already identified in the 1AC and the 1NC. So a lot of the 2AC adds detail and or impact to an argument that was already present earlier in the debate. I just kind of wanted to take note of that even though it's very broad, right, there's a lot of stuff, like the actual terms of clash are relatively narrow because the disagreement is over some core set stuff. Where did the 2AC focus the evidence that they were reading? Like give me a couple themes from the 2AC that you noticed? Taylor, you've been giving us great answers, but I'm once again reaching for some new voices. Yeah.
On the all.
Okay, and what did they say about this?
They specifically contested the idea of a politics of refusal, and that they were arguing that, and it was brought up in Cross as well, that material action or material infrastructure for indigenous communities is particularly vital and should come before like philosophical or immaterial action.
Yeah, I don't care as much about that part if I'm being honest, but because I know a lot of the cross-ex focused on that, and that's probably not the. Let me put it this way: does the AF have a lot of evidence about the word material? A bunch of you are shaking your heads. So like the NEG probably focused their cross-ex there in part because the AF can't refer to a lot of evidence there. Like that's mostly an example of we used some language that we often use in debate. But does the AF have some evidence that contests this notion of refusal?
Yeah.
Okay, what are some of the arguments that contest refusal?
That it kind of, or it obscures indigenous resistance.
Okay, so.
Basically like the Lightfoot evidence.
And when you say existing resistance, what is the AF saying about examples of existing indigenous resistance? Give it to me in terms of, this was not necessarily in one of these tags, but I just want to, one of them actually did include this, like one of the very early examples of this, I think was like 2AC3. I know Lightfoot is a different, that was much later in the debate, but a couple of these cards are kind of connected. Yeah. Yeah, but that's not really what we read a card on. Or, well, that Lightfoot card does contain part of that argument. But that's not what I'm going for. I like your trying. You're adding, but I want to think about like what in terms of examples of existing resistance, what is one of the observations that the AF asks you to make that is significant?
I don't know if this was the Lightfoot card, but I wrote down that like Ilan was talking about how the after way is abolition.
Okay, so we have a different. I'm going to put this in a different category, which is. We'll come back to that one. That's a good thing to observe, but this is not quite related to what I was talking about yet. Okay. I want to just like, I'll press you all a little on like, you are being very drawn to the debate terms that are found in the 2AC rather than the terms from the evidence that are in some of these more complicated tags. That is not unusual, but might be an example that we think about kind of like how thoroughly we need to explain some of our 2AC. Like, do you notice that part of what's happening is like, some of these 2AC arguments, they have the same like density or complexity as some of the 1AC tags, yeah? But it's not always easy to draw all of those connections. So like one thing that I would say to you all in terms of 2AC principles here is like, you must have some clarity or like connect some of the dots for your judges. Because I think we're still missing like a really important 2AC argument up here about the character of existing resistance.
Are you talking about the agonistic component of the inverter?
That's over here. Any more guesses? Just want to note here, this is not an easy set of dots to connect. So like thinking about this set of affirmative strategy then relies a lot on like we are trying to, you know, like we agree, the terms of this debate are very dense, but they're like very deeply interrelated as well. So like that's why thinking about some of these tags and communicating some of the core ideas, I would phrase it as some examples of existing indigenous resistance use recognition or nationality. What's the other word that we might put up here from the cross-ex of the 1NC? What if I gave you the 2AC tag that you know, that we contest a refusal because some existing forms of indigenous resistance use recognition. What cross-ex question of the 1NC set this up? Okay, and what that exactly the right area of that cross-ex, what are some other questions that were asked in connection to that?
Is there going to be action of state action?
We're real close, right? You see why those would be connected too, right? Because it's like, if part of the argument is that a recognition-based politics that says, hey, state, you should recognize our rights claims or our treaty claims, do we get why that is like, that some people might accuse that of being grounded in recognition? Okay, as in the state acknowledges or recognizes a series of prior existing claims or rights? Okay, so think about those terms in connection, rights and recognition, okay, or recognition and acknowledgement, okay? What was the example that the neg, or that the AF used to try and connect these things? Probably the most prominent, in terms of mainstream reportage, the most prominent example of existing indigenous resistance that you are likely to be familiar with.
Activism over the pipeline that was being built under indigenous land.
Okay, and what is the, so, you know, talked about DAPL, Standing Rock, what did that cross-ex question try and connect these things with?
I think the specific question was, can recognition be used as a form of resistance?
Okay,
And
so like,
specifically in that instance, should we honor their calls for recognition?
aha, okay, so like, the 1AC is now observing, well, some forms of indigenous politics and resistance haven't used this language of refusal as much as they have, you know, appealed to notions of recognition, prior existing rights or treaty claims, okay? And that using recognition or nationality might be valuable, yeah? So in that context then, what argument is this, what other important 2AC argument is this connected to? So like, one implication of, what is one strategic implication of this argument? What is the AF trying to set, what is one of the strategies the AF is trying to set up here? If the AF goes for a permutation, what will the neg say is the problem with that permutation? Speak up. That the permutation includes state action, yeah? Okay, and thus is, and because it includes state action, it is part of the internal debate and is therefore not genuine decolonization, right? It's like decolonization needs to be judged as decolonization is outside, genuine decolonization is outside of the internal debate, okay? So what role does this play?
It says that these people who are trying to achieve decolonization use terms of debate in the status quo, and that we should follow that.
Okay, so decolonization might include examples of recognition rather than purely refusal. Therefore, even if there is a link to the permutation, it could still be considered genuine decolonization. Because neither side has said anything about decolonization, wrong, bad, shouldn't do it. They have agreed that decolonization is a desirable goal, yeah? Okay, now, what other argument is connected to, like, that sounds like a no-link argument, which is helpful, like it is useful to say no, genuine decolonization includes recognition. But in order to make this an offensive argument that says, no, we must, or like we ought to include recognition politics as part of decolonization, what is the AF tried to introduce for that argument?
I think it was the claim about infrastructure and like the need for resources in order to actually enable decolonization.
So rebalance and repurpose. What term in the resolution did the 1AC say should be repurposed in order to include aspects of the state's resource distributing capacity? What term from the resolution did the 1AC use for this? This hasn't been a subject of debate yet, but.
Development?
Yeah, development, right? The 1AC said, well, development, that could be an example. We see how development could easily be an example of the internal debate, right? As in like, what is the standard of development? How developed are you? That could easily be an example of the capaciousness of white humanity and its relative violence. Instead, 1AC said development is something that should be repurposed or rebalanced because there is an existing maldistribution of care, infrastructure, and resources, and so part of what will be involved in recognition is also redistribution. That in order for there to be redistribution, there actually must be recognition as part of the AF's claim. Do we get that? Okay. There's one more argument that I want here that's part of the 2AC that we haven't mentioned that I think fits. I see all of these arguments as connected. We don't have to go for them together, but they definitely reinforce one another. There's one major category that I think is missing. There were multiple 2AC cards read on this argument. Let's think about, yeah.
I mean, like an all-failed argument that like they can't overcome the status quo if these like resistance already exists, and they need like it reinforces the need of like permanent like material.
I think that is a really good example of this argument, right? As like, because the imbalance is so stark, gotta use elements of redistribution in order to succeed. Okay, I didn't put inevitability or step, because once again, we're being drawn to some of the debate terms, I think is another lesson that we're drawing here. It's like, notice how easy it could be for the AF evidence to sort of just disappear if we only talk about it using some of the terms that we are familiar with from debate, is one other lesson that I would draw from. Okay. Is there currently, have you all put, this is an offensive argument versus refusal, I think, but is there any other offensive argument about refusal that the AF made?
Refusal stifles all the current progress that was made.
Sorry, say that.
Refusal stifles all the current progress that was made.
Yeah, I don't know if the AF really tried to use the language of progress, maybe for a reason, but okay, does the AF have an argument that it is bad to think of the world purely in terms of refusal versus recognition?
Yeah.
What did they say about that, Kieran?
The idea, like, so when you think about, sorry, this may not be the exact same terms as the 2AC, but yeah, when you think about it purely as, like, binauristic, then there's no hope for change for indigenous peoples because there's not, like, a way in which, there's not, I guess it's really, really hard to create a sense of change because it says that, like, a change is good enough to fully overcome decolonization.
Okay. This was the argument that phrasing decolonization in all or nothing terms makes people hopeless because it either has to be done all at once or it's not worth doing. Okay? Do we see how, connect this to a term that the neg, or like a concept that the neg has used. What could you accuse of being a binary between refusal and recognition in terms of the neg's major concepts? Internal debate, right? Internal debate says there's this whole set of stuff that occurs within the paradigm of liberalism versus conservatism, and then there's stuff that is outside of that, that is beyond the terms of this debate. That's what we want. This argument says we should not frame this in terms of an internal debate and an external debate about the tenets of liberal society, okay? This is an offensive argument about the neg's framework. Second, or kind of another important thing to keep in mind, I promised that we would come back to these arguments over here on AF equals abolition and AF is antagonistic decolonization. Why am I putting these arguments not in the same category as this set of arguments that work together? What argument is that designed to set up? Or just like, why is that different? Thematically, what do these arguments do that these arguments don't?
Well, so the argument about like agonistic decolonization and the other one say that it is the affirmative is closer to being in the direction of decolonization or the alternative or
please write some of this down. Your peers are saying great stuff. Everybody's got like a little piece of this, and maybe not putting some of those pieces together in the big puzzle. So these are no-link arguments in the sense of AF is not part of internal debate, right? In order to answer these arguments, what must the neg do? Like when they get to these cards and they're like, you know, oh, the AF says it's antagonistic decolonization. AF says it's abolition, not reform. Rodriguez says AF okay. What does the neg have to do? The neg is going to concede in the face of these arguments? Like, I doubt it. So let's do a little strategic anticipation. What is the neg going to try and say?
Point out specific ways in which the affirmative action would be representative of I'm not using the right like term here, but the reformism that they were critiquing.
The neg has to respond to these with like, no, you definitely link because, right? So they have to draw the boundaries of internal debate, external debate much more strongly. Yes? What argument does that help the AF? Like, why does the AF want them to do that?
Because then that links them back to this criticism of the binary.
Great, right? Do we see how it's like the AF has multiple strategies going on here, and part of the neg responses to the AF arguments help set up some of the other AF strategy. This 2AC contains multiple possible 2ARs versus this critique. That is another thing I would write down in terms of like, it is fairly difficult, or just like, I will say most times I see a 2AC versus a critique, I see the AF offer one possible 2AR, ultimately. Some version of framework plan focus or a permutation that only makes sense if you accepted the tenets of plan focus. Maybe an impact term, I guess that gets us to 2, sometimes. So, if you value the idea that the neg needs to distribute their time on multiple strategies, you should be thinking about a 2AC strategy that includes multiple possible final avenues, okay? And thinks about how they're related together. So I thought that was an example of something that the 2AC did fairly well. Okay, before the 2NC starts, can everybody stand up and kind of just like, let's get a little more energy, because everybody looks a little sleepy.
Literally jump. This is something I used to do. This works.
Sleepy people.
Okay, are we ready for the 2NC? Okay. Okay.
Now we are sitting back down. We're flowing.
If you have your computer out, like there's no need for that. Please put it away.
Well, I do have a couple people are flowing.
Okay, if you're not flowing,
Yep.
okay. If you're not flowing actively on your computer, but your computer. Okay. Somebody just go to the bathroom. Maybe. Okay. I'm gonna give Matthew 30 seconds. Oh, there's, okay, perfect. Okay, it will be straight down on the critique. There's an overview. I think so, but I wouldn't personally, I mean, you probably should have left enough space for the overview.
I'm taking out a new sheet of paper for the overview.
That's wise, Turner, that's wise.
Notice, if you all followed my advice and flowed 4 to 5 arguments on one side of a sheet of paper, you should currently have roughly 3 sheets of paper for the negatives position.
I have 5 sheets of paper for the negatives. Okay. Anyone not ready? Okay. Y'all good? Settlerism
is grounded in a civilizational imperative sustained through the internal debate over the relative violence of white humanity, which naturalizes and expands racial domestic war through the incorporation of indigenous demands into a settler framework. Here's our argument. The demand for reforms, even radical ones, strengthens and endorses the terms of that internal debate, which guarantees the political outcome will be a reinvention of manifest destiny. You saw this in 1AC Cross-Ex after 8 minutes of waxing poetic about how decolonial they are and how we should imagine radically new futures that we want. In their wildest, most utopian decolonial dreams, the United States as a settler colonial institution still exists. That is precisely how 1NC Rodriguez and Simpson say the grounding premise of reformism crushes decolonial possibility and aspiration while co-opting its language to trick activists and abandon indigenous people. 2 pillars of the internal debate. 1, reconciliation. We police ourselves. Appeals to legal transformation are deadly because liberalism inverts our demands and dreams while making us into the cops in our own heads. The impact is sellout. Think about how Alaska Senator Sarah Palin used her kids' indigenous identity to justify attending literal white supremacist rallies in Charlottesville and saying we should expand oil drilling in the Arctic, which zeroes their appeals to listen to indigenous demands because indigenous people can have politically reactionary stances too. 2nd, respectability. We police others. Their insistence on reform guarantees that quote-unquote respectable movements will be upheld to cascade what by comparison appears as anti-civilizational riots, which is all of their offense about why reformism is good and trying to abandon it is bad. The impact is counterinsurgency, which is why scholars like Eve Tuck can go from saying things like decolonization is not a metaphor to saying I condemn Hamas, which zeroes solvency because it proves the act makes decolonization a receding horizon. You cannot win the internal debate, only refuse its terms. 1NC Rodriguez says when the representatives of civilization extend a helping hand to reform, you must adopt a stance of militant opposition. Only a refusal to take up the internal debate's terms can open the space to abolish the colonialism at the heart of yes impacts. Now, 2EC1 is framework. Our interpretation is that the 1AC is the invitation to the internal debate. The negative may choose to decline that invitation based on the 1AC scholarship and research. Your ballot will not be the F gets the F and the A gets the K because that is exact incorporation that sustains colonialism and lets them cross scales of impact to evaluate to sort of outscale or outcalculate the intimate violences and ways that settlerism is produced and sustained in spaces like debate. When deciding between interpretations, you should account for your own predispositions. If you are a settler, you should apply extreme scrutiny to your own gut feeling that the links aren't a big deal. Reformism might have brought you good. Of course it has, because as settlers, we materially benefit from ongoing dispossession and colonialism, so you should not think about what is easiest for securing your life, but what makes the messy choice to become a traitor to colonialism, even if it feels like you are giving something up. If you are not a settler, you should remember that Rodriguez evidence says that the protection of settlers' institutions is an illusion that can be retracted at any time, i.e. any benefits to their interpretation are illusory and not relevant considerations. Prefer our interpretation. 1 is a durable fiat to add to their clash. Issues like rollback are the most pressing ones for activists, particularly under Trump, but their vision of debate categorically brackets those things, and they said they should not have to think about them because it would make it hard to win the debate. There's no internal link between their interpretation and their actualization of their skills per the case page. That was what to 1NC, 2AC Cross-Ex there. This performs our argument how the internal debate has nothing to redeem and retreats from the issues most proximate to real world activists while simultaneously invoking in the names of indigenous people to rehabilitate the image of reform, which they have conceded is a failed strategy if implemented IRL on the case page vis-a-vis durable fiat. 2nd is a proceduralism decided to their fairness. The presumption that having equal access to liberation between liberalism and conservatism makes a structure equitable distracts from who owns the political arena in the first place. You should tend to what they bracket from discussion or articulate as relevant, i.e. the link debate. Now, they said that we were unpredictable. Wrong. 1 is predictability. Your ballot cannot pass the red deal, but it can refuse the invitation to deliberate over it. 2, it's reciprocal. They read cards about their scholarship being good. They should defend it. You cannot reduce an 8-minute speech to an 8-second plan text because that is the most unpredictable. You should not maximize clash because not all clash is good. Not all debates are worth having. Deliberation with the internal debate distracts from who owns the arena. If we win, then when I see resecure settler colonialism, you should weaponize unfairness against them to discourage participation in the internal debate. They say floating picks and private actor fiat, group it. It's the one on the alt, but you private actor fiat because you fiat the companies won't roll back the app. Now, 2EC2 is that the links are not unique and inevitable. This should frame every moment of the link debate as a performative moment that proves that sort of any invitation to the internal debate will make colonialism inevitable because they've said that the fact that it is non-unique means it is okay if it persists. This is the kind of deliberation of the relative balance of white humanity that always justifies the existence of settlers itself. They said the app is an stand. No, the red deal might be, but you are not the red deal. That was 1AC Cross-Ex. 2EC3 is the permutation begs the question of the links. So I'll do the critical jurisprudence link here. This, the 1AC's critical jurisprudence is what Rodriguez calls a maneuver of sustainability. The reform places supremacist institutions while ensuring white supremacy permeates the order of things. This is an impact turn to their scholarship method. Their card about critical jurisprudence says sovereignty should be fluid. 1AC True Fire et al. 25 says, quote, these alternative forces to acknowledge the Arctic as space where sovereignty, legality, and normativity are fluid and mutable. The concept that sovereignty is fluid is what lets the U.S. break treaties or change their terms. Do you think Trump would not love to hear that indigenous sovereignty is mutable when he going straight towards decolonization? Because that requires affirmation of indigenous nation sovereignty, whereas their legal framework affirms the abandonment of sovereignty. This means their indigenous nation good arguments is neg offense
violence because they abolish its condition of possibility via critical jurisprudence. The impact is neocolonialism. This is the one that's defend evidence. The concept of sovereignty is always fluid, is how Europe was able to fluidly divide the African continent at the Berlin Conference, or Israel encircle more and more Palestinian land. Their critical jurisprudence would celebrate these things as embodying a more fluid and woke version of sovereignty. The same card goes on to say, quote, thinking about ice ice allows us to think fluidly about oceanic spaces in passing. Thinking fluidly about the ocean is what allows the US and China and Russia to expand passages and trade routes in the Arctic, which doubles down on colonialism. Remember that they tagged this card in the one I see about to say things about the Red Nation, but remember too that the Red Nation refuses the concept of fluid sovereignty. Because they think that decolonial sovereignty is good. They've invoked indigeneity to justify a rehabilitation of the colonial image, which is exactly how the plan will go down, which is the example counterinsurgency I gave with Obama and Keystone XL pipeline, being anti-Keystone XL pipeline because it hurts the U.S.'s climate credibility in cross-ex. Now the permutation proper one is an incorporation. Decide if we win a link, i.e. that the act is Cellarist, you should not feel comfortable redeeming any part of it. Permutation is that violent incorporation that trains you to feel comfortable with accepting colonialism. 2 is a redwashing. Decide any combination is empty perms and broken promises that rehabilitate the image of governments and corporations that wreck sovereignty. 3rd is an internal debate. Decide we have to impact on deliberation over legal liberal reform. They've said it's good on framework the reform can't solve. 4th is decolonization. Decide when I see cross-ex where they say their wildest utopian dream involves newest existing proof. They become the crackdown on movements will indefinitely defer the possibility of decolonization into the future. They say that they said to the Red Deal it's straight turn because you do not solve the Red Deal. 4th is their theory of power answers. They say flattening. No, you are the ones who flatten nuance because you think that there is a decolonial possibility that involves the U.S. They say Rodriguez is wrong. Rodriguez votes F. 1 wrong. The title of this article is "Reform is not liberation; it is counterinsurgency," which certainly flows negative. This card says local movements like #8 to abolition are good. The affirmative is not that because it does not aim to abolish the U.S. rather to preserve it. They say the F is actualizable, which is the Red Nation card. No, you conceded it's not on case, but you bracket out the possibility to liberate over those things, which is the rollback argument. 2C5 is decolonial infrastructures are key. This is Leduc and Cowan evidence. 1 is the case that will turn your decolonization into 1 and R2 is re-highlighting. They've read often since their own performance. 2C Leduc says, quote, infrastructure is work to carve out Turtle Island into reserves of settler jurisdiction. We feel it across the whole length of the national border and at the detention camps assembled into saying the U.S. Canada border speaks to seemingly supernatural manifestation of the government's mobilities and destruction of indigenous life, which proves that their preservation of the United States makes those things inevitable. 2C6 is abolition ecology. This does not say this says no state and no market, which means the care turn on case will take it out. To AC7 is the all or nothing. Decide this is the bus rejected. This performs the link because some things should not be compromised on, i.e. whether or not the United States should exist. That is just instruction from framework. 2C8 is repurposing. Settler grammars are good. They ought not be. They ought to not be repurposed. We win our theory of the internal debate. This is the line I went and read in Weinstein crossing decolonization means that scholars have to frame their argument through a doctrinal lens to gain legitimacy. That is the inheritance of manifest destiny that we have impact turn. 9 is the care link. It's the 1 R. 10 is the ecological Indian link. I'll do that here. The Afro-romanticization of indigeneity connected to nature is a settler colonial myth that guarantees the expansion of violence, which is when the argument says, quote, Indian populations understood themselves as being stewards of nature, of their human nature and their homelands. This causes righteous violence because settlers blame indigenous people who do not live to standards they set and save the world.
Why does the act intrinsically contribute to the continuation of the internal debate?
A couple things. The first, and I think that you'll find that this is a relatively predictable place to garner offense, is from your critical jurisprudence that you've articulated is the sort of grounding mechanism of your thought project.
Okay, sure, like indigenous people being able to engage legal systems, but...
Not even necessarily engage legal systems. Specifically, we've pulled lines from your evidence that say that in your critical jurisprudence, sovereignty should be fluid and mutable. We should think fluidly about oceanic spaces in passing.
What's the implication of sovereignty being fluid?
Well, it straight turns your arguments about how indigenous nationhood is good, because sovereignty being fluid is the logic of breaking treaties by being like, well, indigenous people might have had a claim to be sovereign here, but I don't think we should think about it like that. Instead, I think we should be a little more fluid about it.
How does that lead to that implication? What's the internal link between those?
Because this concept that sovereignty of indigenous nations ought to be fluid is precisely how, colonial nations are allowed to sort of supersede or continue stepping on the toes of indigenous people. I gave a couple of examples.
So, what's your alternative framework? Rather than viewing sovereignty as fluid, what's your alternative framework?
Refusal to view sovereignty as fluid. The alternative debate will be in the 1 and R.
Okay, I don't get to cross-ex the 1 and R. So
yeah, I agree.
How do you view the concept of sovereignty if not fluid?
Okay, so the affirmative has said it would be good if sovereignty is fluid. Our argument is that the refusal to take you up on that debate of how fluid should sovereignty be.
Okay.
Is the performance of
I'm
sovereignty.
not asking about the alternative. I'm asking about your theory.
Sorry,
How does your theory conceptualize sovereignty if not being fluid?
I think that our conception of sovereignty, well, what do you, wait, hang on. That framing of that question already presumes that sovereignty should be.
You have criticized
how
our
does it
evidence.
conceptualize
You have
sovereignty if
criticized
not
our
fluid?
evidence.
Girl, not fluid, what do you mean?
What is that?
You cannot even mentally conceptualize what would be outside of that, which is a performative moment that ought to demonstrate to you all how the internal debate has already shaped the terms
What
of
is the
our deep colonial
implication
utopian
of
imagination
sovereignty
can be.
being not fluid?
I
What
gave
is
a couple of examples. It's what lets the
no,
US
not sovereignty
treat-
being fluid.
Okay.
Sovereignty being not fluid. What is the implication of that?
It is a world that cannot be imagined from within the internal debate because it is one where the US is not a horizon that would exist.
Okay, so what does that world
So
look
I
like
understand-
outside of the internal debate?
That will be the one in our argument is that we could have had a better debate, one that did not operate within the terms of liberal versus conservative.
What do better debates
reform
look
versus-
like?
Now you're asking about the alternative, which I've told you like 5 times will be in the
I
one.
don't get to cross-ex the one in R. I'm asking you how this interacts with your conception as sovereignty as not fluid.
Yes, from the starting point of sovereignty as not fluid, from the starting point that the US ought not exist at all, we can have deliberations that are not about reform. Those deliberations might look like things like that might let us answer questions like how should we conceptualize different futures, how should we adopt paradigms of caretaking that do not rely on extraction.
It seems like you're not really defending anything,
I want to do well.
Don't say quick now. Don't say quick now.
So, a few things about what the 2NC is doing here. Okay, first, what did the 2NC do in the overview?
Just kind of like re-explain and like extend all their
Sorry, speak up a little bit.
like re-explain and like extend all of their like arguments.
Okay, so you like re-explain. I guess what I'm asking for a little bit here is like, why do you think that the 2NC spent this time in this way?
I think that the overview was really effective because it didn't sound like copying and pasting blocks. It was really specific to the app and the plan itself.
Okay.
I think that it talks specifically about links, which obviously they expected more from the bottom of the page, but they were just links to the plan and what the plan did. And both the plan and the part about like individual people. Because I feel like the overview was also differentiating like what the alternative versus the
Alternative versus AF, clearly establish a bunch of terms, use some examples for understanding those terms. Like I agree with that. Do we also agree that a lot of the terms that were defined and explained in the 2NC overview were those that are currently up on the board? So like internal debate got a lot of explanation about what that is. We spent a lot of time, with me trying to draw that out of you all after the 1NC, yeah, right? So that was in part to kind of put you all on the same page because this argument is complex and we're trying to go through the details of the argument. But do you see how part of what the 2NC was trying to do then was like all of that stuff that we were talking about to get you all to like understand how to read the negative evidence, the like key terms in the debate. The 2NC did that, yeah? Is that helpful for would you now be in a better position if you were reading the negative cards at the end of the debate? Does this overview help you understand what you are reading? Okay, I think yes. And that's one thing that I think is just very important for understanding that you've got to just, rather than assume, I would say that the negative here did not assume that you all were already familiar with every part of this position. They tried to kind of give you a bit of scaffolding or infrastructure, if you will, for understanding the larger terms of the debate. That seemed very helpful, at least to me. 2, what is the focal point, or kind of what did the 2NC spend the most time on in terms of a category of argument? Yeah, a framework got a fair amount of attention, but I wouldn't say that's where the most time got spent. Link, and the permutation, which is also an issue in terms of permutation debates rely on or circle around, right? Are they connected to link arguments? So why do we think that happened in this debate? Like, why is the negative spending so much time on link arguments?
Because this is kind of, in some ways, both things have agreed that decolonization is like the biggest priority. So understanding the ways in which the act fails to do decolonization is kind of the key way that the negative can win.
Yeah, right? Like, this is a debate in which most of the impact arguments aren't going to receive a ton of attention because implicitly both sides agree on large portions of that impact. Logically, it would make sense then that the neg would be spending a lot of time on these like link and internal link questions about whether or not the AF is decolonization, how decolonization must occur, whether or not the AF meets that definition. Like all of those things receive a lot of attention because that's like the key point of clash here is not the impact, it's the link and internal link arguments about how to understand the concept of decolonization and how to achieve it, yeah? Like, that's an important strategic observation in terms of if this AF, let's imagine that this AF were, one of the, most of the labs have either produced or seen an AF that is about like US foreign policy objectives in the Arctic, right? So like the ASW AF or the one that is about the Joint Task Force in the Arctic or Arctic Command, yeah? In a debate about that, would the AF and the neg agree on the impact arguments? No. So we would then have a lot more attention paid to those arguments. Would there be any debate about whether or not the AF is part of the internal debate? Would that be clear from the beginning? Okay, so we would still need to explain what we mean by that, right? But we wouldn't have to spend a lot of time explaining whether or not the AF is that. Does that difference make sense? So like portions of the overview that explain the concept of the internal debate, some of those pieces might show up in that circumstance. But like all of this stuff about kind of like whether or not the AF is decolonization, what decolonization genuinely is, kind of is the AF part of the internal debate, that would probably not be necessary there. Should the 1NC shell for this position be the same versus those two categories of affirmative? People are shaking their heads. Why not? Why not?
The focus of like the other apps is that's more like say like Russia or China, whereas here it is focusing on like native indigenous communities in the Arctic.
Okay, so the impact arguments would be different. So the 1NC should spend more time on what 1NC cards would we want to swap in here if we were debating this different category of AF. We would need some more arguments about the impact comparison and about the impacts themselves because, right, notice just this 1NC time allocation reflected the type of debate that they were going to have. Did the 1NC feature a lot of impact arguments or like different impact cards? No, okay, it did not. Did it feature a lot of detail on the link level? Yeah, it did. So instead, one thing that just like I would encourage everybody to be thinking about is that even for a position that like broadly applies to, a different way of thinking of this is, if this position views the world in terms of an internal debate between liberal reformism and conservative opposition, the shell would change based on whether or not the 1AC is an example of trying to position itself as a liberal reform that is on, kind of like attacks the relative violence of settler society versus opposition to reform that tries to consolidate the terms of that society. Yeah? So just be thinking about this in terms of like, I suspect that there are many of you who will, treat many of these critical arguments that we have produced, like we wrote them as generics, right? As in they will apply to a lot of stuff. That doesn't mean that you should be reading the same version of that argument versus all of the AFs. Just like I wanted to zoom out a little bit on the 2NC, the way the 2NC distributed their time reflects how the 1NC cards are distributed in terms of time. Did the neg need to read a lot of new cards to establish the link? Like, did they need to read tons of new cards because there were no link arguments in the 1 and C. No, they spent a lot of their time early there so that they could explain and apply the arguments later. Yeah? Okay. Last question about kind of how the 2NC went about this set of arguments. What is the 2NC doing, like, given that there is some base level agreement about the impact of colonization, what is the focal point for the neg when they reference the impact arguments? Like, what is the neg paying attention to there? Most of these arguments are phrased in terms of turning or accessing the case arguments, right? So like the examples are given in terms of the case, but then explained as the negative impact. Here is an example that if we do this process of incorporating or integrating the red deal into the internal debate, here is what will happen. Okay, so you might hear this discussed as kind of phrasing the implications to the link arguments, right? It's like every link argument receives an example of what this means for the process of decolonization or for the effects of advocating for the red deal. Yeah? So that's kind of like a way to think about what the 2NC was trying to accomplish here is even though they were spending most of their time on the link arguments, every link argument is then related back to what will happen in terms of this concept that we agree about, decolonization. Okay, so just drawing some attention to that. Do you think that the neg spent were they fairly effective in communicating those examples?
Yeah.
Yeah, like we feel like we understand the terms of this debate a little bit better, yeah? So, like, the other contrast that I would draw here is that despite the fact that this critical argument is complicated, the negative is not trying to obfuscate, like, or make things less clear. The negative is trying to walk you through all of those terms and, like, help you understand it. I think that's pretty good judge adaptation in the sense that not everybody here is familiar with this argument already. But it's also just like good thinking about like, do you currently feel like you have a decent idea of what the 2NR might sound like for how you will be instructed to decide the debate? Like, will the way that you expect the negative to explain how the debate will be decided, will it be related to how the terms that the 2NC set up in the overview? Yeah, okay, so the time that went into this is time that will help give instructions for how to make a decision. The overview did some of that already in terms of just like, if you decide that they are part of the internal debate, here's the impact that that has on whether or not there will be decolonization. We all agree that decolonization is the goal here because the AF said that too. So if we win a turn, then we're golden. Like that's another way of thinking about what the 2NC did. Okay, are we ready for the 1NR? Let's go for it. Oh, you were literally exactly mine. It's like, oh, one's in the bathroom. Nope. Okay. Where are we headed?
We are headed to the alternative. I would get a separate sheet because I don't trust
Okay, I don't want to get a separate sheet out, so what 2AC argument would you say you're starting?
Oh, straight down, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like all things, yeah, in order. So I'm starting, there is an alternative overview.
Yep. Aha.
Yes,
Okay.
there you go. And then it will go in the order of all of the line by line.
So we're starting with
Yes.
the arguments that the 2AC referenced as the alternate.
Yes, and then case. Good luck, that's all I have for you, I don't know if there's more to that. So sorry. I will use eyeballs and lack of shifting of, paper to discern the folks already.
should be like right where the 2NC left off. Like,
You ready, folks? Okay. Vote negative to refuse the ethical and feel-good politics of the 1EC. Any risk of a link means that you vote negative and flip your calculus to account for your Western predispositions to believe that solvency must look or sound a certain way. The alternative is a reconceptualization of decolonial practice that accounts for the multiplicity in indigenous thought and resistance, refusing the internal debating questions of reform or not to reform, maintain notions of indigenous placelessness. It's a form of academic and embodied refusal, a way of reckoning with the colonial forms of thinking and strategy, believing that exceed the limitations and combat the pathological description of indigenous subjects as drifting or transient and incapable of making change. The app does not solve this. The alternative is best. It's not a pick. No warrant for why. Picks are bad. The decolonial education and method testing of the alternative outweighs any risk of an impact. Also, flag this on your flow. If private actor is non-government actors recross-ex with the 2AC, then there is a double permed or a double bind. Either they link to their private actor fiat bag too, or they don't get any of their app solvency arguments about indigenous activists and organizations doing shit, because that is a double standard. You should use that to frame the rest of your app offense versus the alternative. Colonial projects will always create arbitrary distinctions that foreground the needs and desires of the state at the expense of decolonial projects. All proper. 2AC1, no mechanism. Yes, there is a mechanism just exists outside of the colonial frame enacted by indigenous communities too. If they win, no mechanism applies just as much to them because they also rely on actions, beliefs, and organizations of indigenous communities, but fiat them, which means that there's a consensus at 3. We have impact during the prioritization of material strategies. It's arbitrary, and there's a spirituality to the assumption that the physical realm, language of materialism, and synonymizing of government action with being more real alienates indigenous spiritual practices that are very much real turns the case and demonstrates that the 1EC will always sacrifice indigenous beliefs and practices if it has to defend the U.S. imperial project, if that defense is on the line. That's been an acre and 20. 2AC2, cases of dissent, no, it's patriotic sentimentality. We'll answer 2AC2 and 3 on case proper. 2AC4, refusal stifles activism, no link. The alternative doesn't reject indigenous activism, it rejects attempts to patriotic apologia and attempts to redeem the government despite its sole role in the alienation and genocide of those outside the scope of white lives. Last time I checked, there are a lot of things that stifle indigenous activism, and none of them are the decolonial strategy of the alternative. There's policing, crackdown, white disease, religious assimilation, capitalism, corporation, stealing of land, prisons, corporate injection of drugs and alcohol, historical erasure of indigenous resistance in academic institutions. So students like you believe that the only way to solve shit is like the case. Not today, Satan. All of these things are reproduced and maintained by other actors that the United States government and imperial core all are responsible for. The last time I checked, there is only one side trying to maintain them as a co-signer of the plan. Star it. Hello? Just in case we weren't clear, the alternative is best. 2AC5, investment. No reason to reject not a reason to reject the alternative. Case doesn't solve it. Yikes. Extend the 1AC. And evidence the money and investment has to come from somewhere. The 1AC project of investment becomes a form of economic coercion, e.g. the passing of the plan results in woke corporations and whatever government organizations are left after, the orange guy is done, I guess, are left, use their investment in indigenous care infrastructure as a way of controlling indigenous communities and the narrative of the U.S. This is the 1AC cross-ex example about Obama from Spencer earlier. 2AC6, not a reason to reject the alternative. Case doesn't solve this, nor does it follow the lead of indigenous communities, but coerces and controls them. Done above, you should have a high threshold for solvency. They better be able to guarantee that indigenous communities will have the full control that they need, the full control they need. They cannot do this where they have sought to maintain the U.S. This is the cross-ex interaction between Spencer and Ilan, like not 30 seconds ago. 2AC7, refusal, bad. We have impact during this in the context of the app, and the answer, residual offense above. It's good, especially because they're colonial. Case. Jesus Christ. Presumption, cross-apply private actor argument from above. 1AC demands cannot do anything without indigenous action, and the only way for them to do that is to fiat it, which means that they have to coerce or co-opt them. There's a consent, disad the care debate proper, extend the beastly Hibachi evidence. The plan mandates the infrastructure of caretaking, guarantees a reactionary political program that exploits those relegated to positions of caretaking. Their evidence, normal means of caretaking is unpaid exploitation. That's the 1AC Red Nation 21 evidence. Iowa, Kansas reads green. Caretakers like parents and water protectors produce the means by which we live, yet they are not paid, keeping whole communities afloat. They glorified this unpaid labor as the proper embodiment of indigeneity, which is the dichotomy stuff I did before on the alternative. That's 20C, Red Nation 21. We still read green. Work is a form of indigenous excellence. This is the kind of pull yourself up by the bootstrap mentality that means that the labor and caretaking falls disproportionately on indigenous women and black indigenous women, and particularly black. If they refuse, they are told that they are not embodying indigenous excellent enough, which results in their killing or their alienation, which is the respectability argument from the 2NC. It means even if they win that the plan is a decolonial revolution, which it is not, it fails to in lockstep with the patriarchal violence, i.e. like the cover-up of sexual assault at the no dabble camps and protests, etc., which were not mentioned. The 2AC care step, yes link. Every time you hear the 1AR, 2AR say the U.S. is key, it must be material. We have an ethical obligation. Those are all appeals for you to care for the indigenous community, because if we don't, then who will? This infantilizes them and is terminally paternalistic, and we have impact on this. There's no homogenization of care argument. This had no warrant in the 2AC. The app flattened care when they created a value distinction between material forms of care and immaterial immaterial forms of care, which is the impact or ideal above. There's no offense or warrant for how they shift away from capitalism. You should have an incredibly high fucking threshold because all of the reasons I listed above on the alternative debate about the way in which there are too many material preconditions that they cannot resolve without putting indigenous communities on the line.
Okay, so we heard more about the alternative and about the case. I want to hear from everybody about what the terms, like, use a couple of the terms from both the 2NC and the 1NR to characterize that alternative. Like, what are we doing? Refusal of what?
Like internal debate and states and
Okay, so we have an argument that is basically like refusal is now being explained in terms of this concept of invitation, right? That was in the 1NC shell as well, that the AF invites you to join this internal debate or to integrate the question of the Red Deal and colonization into it, and you should not do that. You should say, I will not accept the terms of the internal debate.
There's a lot of questions about how we as intellectuals should refuse to invest into the idea that liberal reform is the only way that progress can progress, I guess.
So the alternative, notice, and this is also common and sometimes a source of frustration for some of you all, like more of the alternative arguments were defined in opposition to this than they were in terms of truly filling out all of the stuff that's out here, yeah? Do we agree with that? Okay, was there a warrant for why that would or could or should happen? Did the negative discuss like why their arguments are happening that way? This is a common strategic move. The Cross-Ex was pretty frustrated about hearing about some of this stuff about the alternative. Yeah, go ahead. We don't yet understand its terms because we are too thoroughly inside. Yeah? It's like that could be an argument for how or why we are less familiar with what those terms might sound like, or how it is that we would make some of those arguments, what it is that we might do. Like part of what the neg is trying to do is basically because what does the neg want if you were to say the category of argument that the neg wants to say is the most important for your decision, what would it be? And now I am asking for a debate term. I'm not asking for something from Rodriguez. You think that the neg wants the debate to be mostly about the alternative?
I think so, because I think the alternative
I'm pushing back on this one a little bit. I think that the neg wants the debate to be mostly about the link. They expect you to give the debate as like a, did the neg win that the AF was an example of the internal debate, yes or no, right? And part of the reason that they phrase their alternative arguments is basically like the terms of the internal debate have obscured what it is that we might do or how we could talk about it or what decolonization might become, right? That's the neg strategically kind of focusing the decision back on, well, this internal debate thing is it has obstructed our understanding so thoroughly that we can't reach beyond it to understand what these different terms might look like because, because the link is so good. Do you see how the neg's kind of doing that? Okay? So one of the things that might be important to think about then is what do we think or how do we think the AF could do anything about that? I mentioned this earlier.
Framing the link through the solvency of the whole.
The NAF might want to ask some questions about solvency. I agree with that. Put in terms of some of the earlier stuff that I was talking about, what did the neg indeed do in this block? Which set of arguments did they make?
Well, they sort of, I guess, the AF can maximize offense off of the binary they're contributing to. Yeah, they pretty much can use
They
those.
spent a lot of time, like, they didn't necessarily spend as much time on these cards, right? They did, and they went to that Rodriguez card that the AF read. But do we see how conceptually the neg spent a lot of time answering the idea that the AF meets the criteria of like abolition or radical decolonization? Like they tried to say basically, no, you are only internal. There is no radical component of this. There is no distinction between you and the existing terms of the debate. They spend a lot of time on that, yeah? So, if you were the AF and you're thinking now about how to distribute 1 hour time, what is some of the way that you might distribute your time? Like, because, okay, what's about to be really difficult about this 1 hour?
I guess that they have to prove that they're not in the internal debate.
I'll rephrase that slightly as like, you agree, you're saying it would be very difficult for the AF to prove that they have nothing to do with the internal debate.
Yeah.
Yeah? Why would that be difficult?
Well, because I think, I don't know, like my understanding of the internal debate is that it's like liberal, like legislation, like, and they are very much legislation.
Okay, so you feel pretty good about the negatives link explanation. Yeah?
Yeah, I think the internal debate, like the way they defined it seems broad enough to encompass like, you know,
The neg spent a lot of time on this. The neg made that category both very broad and like made those distinctions pretty strong. Yes, we agree with that. Okay, so like I'm gonna guess, for those of you who have given 1 hours versus Ks before, okay, what is one of the many difficulties about this moment?
There's substantial opposition work and making it proper. That is really hard to group and quickly because dropping into DAs means you drop very significant elements. So probably that.
Great description. There's a lot of offense going on in different parts of the debate, making consolidation fairly difficult, right? And another way that I would phrase this is just like, because many of the portions of the debate are interconnected, like if this were a disadvantage, the choice to go for kind of like, well, we're going to extend uniqueness and a link turn, or we're going to extend our impact takeouts and our link takeouts, right? You can more easily separate those categories, yeah? This is a little bit difficult to, like here, if the AF is like, we're only going for no link, is that going to work out well for them? No. Okay, so the AF has multiple things that interact that they need to deal with, but if the neg spent a lot of their time doing this, that is answering and consolidating kind of the difference between internal debate and not, okay, so like they've spent a lot of time explaining the link, what is one of the ways that the AF can catch up a little bit, maybe in terms of time allocation?
Instead of like spending a lot of time on like that one argument, the AF can like answer the other arguments that weren't covered as deeply as just that one.
Okay.
So the time allocation wouldn't be as skewed towards the other.
So we're looking for some of the arguments that maybe got less attention, less time, to see if there's something that we can use well there. I agree with that.
Maybe like go for this critique of binarism and can sort of concede.
Does this, in order to win this set of arguments, does the AF need to prove that they are not part of the internal debate? Does the AF need to win no link in order to win the set of arguments over here? Aha. So, we talked about how the neg the neg is setting up a situation in which they want kind of the primary category for making your decision to be about their link arguments, because they think that their link arguments mean that they access or turn the case impact, right? It's like, that's their real focal point. The alternative is explained mostly in terms of avoiding the link, rather in terms of some of the stuff that it might do differently, right? That was part of the exchange for the cross-ex. The neg had a warrant for that, but like still, I would say that that's characteristic of the neg's explanation, okay? So the AF instead could go for some of these arguments that aren't premised on no link. That is, the AF needed this other strategy that wasn't premised on no link in order to rectify some of the time imbalance on like the neg the neg could always spend a lot of time explaining their link arguments in this situation, right, in this block. And so it could be very, like, it's very helpful in some ways for the AF to have something that is a different strategy that they could pursue. Different question, what did the 1NR do to try and make it so that, what arguments are in the 1NR that the AF must pay a great deal of attention to?
A lot of the case arguments and case terms.
Okay, so the case is, the 1NR has related all of the case arguments back to a bunch of the link stuff that they spent a bunch of time on, right? So like now, the case arguments are explained in terms of the negative's larger position, right? We started out there, but like the 1NR made those connections very clear, right? So I think that's good. They connected the case debate there, so like there's a lot of coverage that implicates both parts of that. What else?
I think the most threatening thing, in my opinion, is this durable fiat argument. I think the debate on both, like on the alt page and the classified allowing case is pretty condemning because the AF either needs to prove like if they're not fiating this, to which point it wouldn't be coercion, or that they need to find some other way to access their solvency.
I agree that it's like, this was a place where the AF, like a significantly strategically powerful part of the AF arguments, and certainly a large portion of the AF arguments about the case were about durable fiat. And so the neg tried to turn those into a potential source of offense, right? Like they have a criticism of the notion of durable fiat. They have some arguments for why durable fiat might not be a desirable concept to deploy. They have some arguments basically that link the durable fiat issue back into the terms of their larger critique, right? It's like, oh, the durable fiat is a feature of the internal debate. It assumes basically a baseline for this and assumes that we can just wish away aspects of rollback, legal challenges, kind of the whether or not the Trump administration would be likely to implement the plan. Like they've tried to make the debate a little bit more about would than should. Yeah, or explain why, if you think the debate is about should, that has some other serious significant problems. They've made link arguments about having the debate be about should. So I expect that we will try and hear something from the AF on that set of front, but I agree that's an argument that the AF just like, they must say something about that in order to deal with components of this 1NR. That is, the 1NR made a significant offensive argument that requires AF response, right? When they went to the case, they weren't only making purely defensive arguments. We didn't hear a lot about like, warming will be gradual, so communities will be okay, or adaptation is strong, or, like we didn't hear case defense that doesn't fit with the larger negative position. Okay, that's my greatest frustration in a lot of the critical debates that I see in high school is that the case arguments have nothing to do with or like not connected at all to the larger critical position, or maybe directly contradictory with it, right? Like all of the cards that we would go for to like find warming slow or adaptation strong don't sit very well with the we need a revolutionary approach to where our society is at.
Turner, it's 11:30. That's my concern.
Yep. I'm wrapped up. So we're ready for the 1 hour? Okay.
Alright, the order is case and then the critique. Order on case is like pretty much top down, but everything else and then the character. Is anyone not good? Okay.
Vote out for the red deal. We don't link to private actor fiat. We fiat the United States federal government, and we've read evidence that normal means is follow on. That also takes out the consent dissent because we are the only ones that have evidence that indigenous people want the plan. Next, the care K. What is the definition of care that you operate from? How does the AF's defense of indigenous caretaking systems reproduce anti-blackness? These are the questions the negative has not answered that make it a non-viable 2NR. The 1AC never mandates a singular ethic of mothering or coerced care, nor does it reproduce the hierarchical structures the neg critiques there. Framing essentializes care as always already complicit, but we show it can be re-articulated through indigenous worldviews grounded in reciprocity and land-based relationality. The Red Deal envisions care as collective responsibility, not discipline. The plan funds the infrastructure indigenous communities themselves demand to sustain life, not impose state-led welfare. We are not universalizing care, we're enabling autonomous care rooted in specific land traditions and needs. In the context of the AF, care is not soft power. It is a radical alternative to capitalist extraction and a condition for decolonial resurgence. Even if care has been historically weaponized against black women into hierarchical structures, they have not done the analysis necessary to show how this will reproduce itself in the world of the affirmative, which makes it functionally a non-unique dissent to the quo, especially because they have not explained why their evidence about interpersonal care under neoliberalism links to the way our authors identify caring for system structures and non-human life systems while intervening in neoliberalism. The critique. First is framework. Evaluate the material consequences of the plan and the political project of the Red Deal. The impact is clashed as both external and solves for their offense. Clash through targeted research and testing is preferable compared to a broad sweeping echo chamber. Clash is the only thing that produces better advocates through a well-choreographed strategy. Every reason you think the state is bad is better combated through our model. Next is all of their offense links to about fairness and proceduralism is irrelevant because we have not read a fairness argument. Next is the fiat dissent. This is not cruel optimism. We're under no illusion that the plan happens, but fiat combats it. It's an extremely pessimistic way of looking at the world because most of us know the plan won't happen, but still debating because it's an educational thought experiment. Even if the plan is not feasible, it's still valuable to debate because that's our skills argument above. Next, the proceduralism dissent. Even if the plan is better than the status quo, we've justified our research. Remember that our term is additive, not exclusive. They get their critique, but they need unique links to the plan or the political project. Their link argument that uniqueness means we are okay with colonialism is wrong. They need to win uniqueness because obviously colonialism exists, but the actors impose a unique investment into it. We should prefer debates about the desirability of responding to that system. Next, their model says that you should view the AF as an invitation to the internal debate. You should reject their model. It presumes they want to link in theory of power as the starting point for the debate. They bracket out the entirety of the 1AC, which only requires them to win colonialism is true for you to vote nay. The internal debate thesis is wrong. Only our Rodriguez evidence went fully mishandled. All they said is we don't abolish the U.S. We are not trying to. Rodriguez explicitly says certain reforms can be productive if they take an abolitionist approach and offend vulnerable populations by defunding the police, military, and providing universal housing. All of those are explicitly advocated for in the Red Nation's Policy Advocate, which makes their theory functionally unwinnable in the permanent TKO. Next, Shibari highlighting the fluidity debate is a whole lot of nonsense. The 2NC cross-ex was embarrassing, and they were not able to articulate what the implication of that is and what their alternative conception is. They have not answered what it means for sovereignty to be not fluid. The part of the card they conveniently did not include is the recutting that says thinking on speculative registers can now reassemble legal sovereignty constructs in response to the polls changing landscapes, which is why fiat is good. The link debate. The silver re-highlighting for the ecological Indian link is zero. It's not anyone prescribing a stereotype on indigenous people, but rather indigenous people referring to themselves. The neg is more paternalistic because they don't let indigenous people describe themselves in ways they want to. Next, the Leduc and Cowan re-highlighting. That's our argument, is that infrastructure has historically been used to carve up Turtle Island. The evidence says, quote, a pipe can carry fresh water as well as toxic sludge, which is an argument about why infrastructure should be repurposed. The permutation, perm do both. They drop refusal alone fails. Combining with a political action is key to dismantle and replace colonial systems. Reclaiming infrastructure and space is a form of refusal. The Carlson card was fully dropped in his fire and mentions refusal by name, saying disrupting settler governance requires political engagement rooted in indigenous relationality. The redwashing dissent is highlighted and nothing at best. It says the Fed is ignoring indigenous rights, but that's wrong in the context of the absence. The perm would adopt the Red Deal and an ethic of refusal. Next is the decolonization dissent is wrong. There's no warrant for crackdown. We have evidence that the plan will be enforced. It begs the question of fiat, which was done above. Their alternative has no heuristic for organizing in the face of a fascist surveillance state that will crack down on any anti-statist movement, which is why only the plan can reduce carceral institutions. We implement land back, redistribute funds from carceral institutions to revitalize culture and language for genocidal reversals and implement indigenous goals. They tell you a lot of arguments about why the United States federal government cracks down on indigenous resistance, but don't tell you what we are supposed to do in response to that. Obviously, something which reduces the carcerality of the state would be good for indigenous movements. Next, the state is good. Our state good arguments impact on the rest of the critique. There's a couple of frames. First is extend life, but assuming the state is an unchanging colonial force overdetermines co-optation and underestimates the capacity of indigenous actors to strategically navigate institutions of real gains. This pessimism trap forecloses possibilities for engagement by assuming any interaction with the state is surrender, which eliminates key resistance strategies while isolating the forms of resistance which exist in the swell. The O rejects all these in favor of performative refusal. We think that's a settler move to innocence. The Madison evidence says only material reforms can change the fabric of settler society. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's state seizure and redistribution.
Okay. One AR. How did the 1AR distribute time here? So give me a set, give me the themes that the 1AR includes.
Mostly focused on the ranking term, not much on the alternative.
Well, what arguments did the 1AR include about the alternative?
The stuff about the state being good and then rejecting it in all instances is bad, and like with evidence.
Okay, so does the 1AR include an offensive argument about the alternative? Okay, it does. So I was pushing back on they spent no time on that stuff, okay, right? It includes an offensive argument about the alternative, as in total rejection of state and or recognition bad, okay? What else does this 1AR include thematically? A perm, okay? Why would those two things go together? Why would we want both of them in this 1AR rather than only one or the other? We gotta. Okay, so the portions of the alternative that we don't have a turn to, we can also talk a little bit about. Not always, it's not always internal debate good. Refusal sometimes powerful, but refusal not always powerful, right? So these arguments are interrelated because our turn is something that our permutation can use that as a net benefit, right? It's just it is desirable that we try and combine refusal and recognition in certain circumstances, or navigate that a little bit differently than just only refusal, right? What other themes are in this 1AR? The 1AR makes arguments about framework, as in what does the AF get access to, how do we judge the relationship between affirmative and negative arguments, but it phrases them mostly in terms of clash rather than in terms of procedure, right? I think that there are some ways in which thematically that fits with the rest of the AF, right? Is are offensive arguments for recognition sometimes useful? Existing examples of that may be powerful. All of those arguments are reasons why we shouldn't assume that we should refuse an invitation to the internal debate, right? The negatives framework argument was phrased in part in relationship to their alternative. It was phrased as refuse the invitation. So if we have arguments that are offensive against refusal, do we have reasons that we ought to clash over whether or not the state is good or bad? Yeah, so now some of the do you see how it's if this is done well, some of the ways in which it may be difficult to separate categories of arguments could also benefit the AF as well, not just the neg, right? The fact that it may be difficult to disentangle is suddenly we can make a single piece of affirmative offense into something that applies to multiple parts of the debate as well. Okay? That's just kind of a strategic feature of these debates that's a little bit different for both the AF and the neg than it might be in the counterplanned DA debate that you saw in the other demo debate, right? It's interrelationship cuts both ways. The AF, single pieces of AF offense may implicate multiple parts of the rest of the debate. Any other important themes that are in this 1AR?
They spent a lot of time on the link as well, because we were talking about before, since a lot of it, both the AF and the NEG agree on what the impact is of public colonialism, and so a lot of it has to do with the block spent a lot of time on the link, so obviously the 1AR had to respond to all of that, since a lot of it, the whole premise of it was whether they linked to perpetuating civil colonial violence.
I think you're spot on here, except I want to elaborate a little bit on one way in which this happened. Does the AF spend a lot of time saying that they are not an example of reform or not part of the internal debate? There's quick reference to that Rodriguez card, but even that is phrased as some reforms can be good, right? Okay, so I agree with you, the AF spent some time on the negative link arguments, but what portions of those arguments did the AF spend time on?
Whether or not like being inside the internal debate was bad. Like,
they spent time on the implications of, like, either the, you could phrase those as the impacts to the links, the implications, the internal links into decolonization, or the turns. Like, they spent time on the second part of every one of those link arguments rather than the first part in most cases. Do we see how that worked, right? So like infrastructure, I thought was an example here. The like, what phrase did the AF use to explain their infrastructure argument? Pipes can carry toxic waste, or like toxic pollutants or fresh water, sludge or fresh water. Like, that's an evocative way. The 1AR can be pretty quick on that argument because that's a phrase from a 2AC card. Okay, just to, if we didn't pick up on that, that's a phrase from a 2AC card. It's evocative in terms of like infrastructure could be good or bad. We don't know for sure, so we should try and build the good stuff rather than assume that it will all be bad. I thought that was an interesting way of phrasing that argument. So do we see how it's like that deals with the impact argument about infrastructure much more, or like the internal link arguments about whether or not infrastructure building is part of colonialism or decolonization, not is the AF, like, is infrastructure internal debate, yes, no. Okay? So that's one of the things that you might want to think about is, rather than phrasing all of the responses to the link arguments as no link, instead, the AF tried to answer, excuse me, the part of those arguments that were about the turns, or the impact to the link arguments. It's like I thought that was, strongly on display here, and something that is difficult to do or like difficult to conceptualize, but something that you should always have in mind. Okay. Any other kind of features from this 1AR that you think that we ought to highlight?
It spent a lot of time answering the care critique, which I think was helpful because it sort of also served to paint what the affirmative does, which strengthened a lot of their arguments on critique when talking about what materials they actually teach.
I think that's a good point, and another example of how the interrelationship between the case arguments and the critique, that can also cut both ways, right? Could the AF use some of their answers to the care critique to, if the negative does not extend its critique of care infrastructure, can the AF use some of those arguments versus the other parts of this position? People are nodding their heads, okay? So like, do you see how, same principle of like, the AF tried to make some offensive arguments there that the neg can't simply just kind of like not go to that page anymore after investing all that time in it. So the AF tried to pay attention to, if I'm going to spend a bunch of time on this argument on the case, I need to make sure that it has some implications that aren't just about the way that the neg made the argument. We need to be able to use all of this time as part of an offensive argument in the 2AR. Okay. Yep. Okay. 2NR time.
Case.
Should we wait for Azja, or are we good?
Should we wait for Azja? How are we doing?
I think that we should go.
White ones. Please, like, empty.
Okay. Anybody not ready? Okay.
Dartmouth, Berkeley cannot win this debate when the 1AR is heavily reliant on reformism. Good argument with a crackdown push, but they have conceded all of our arguments about how they are the ones that are performing the crackdown, along with contextual work and theory of settler colonialism through the internal debate between liberalism and conservatism, that all demonstrates that the very terms of rejoining the nitty-gritty of infrastructures of caretaking would perform the recognition and respectability that trains us to become the police that crack down on those movements and reinvent sludge to manifest destiny by setting a brick wall at our horizon, our political imaginations, at the abolition of the United States itself. The 2AR will sort of beg you to reconcile indigenous jurisprudence with the law itself. When they do, remember 2NC judge instruction totally dropped in the 1AR. If you are a settler, you should apply extreme scrutiny to your gut feeling the reformism might be good, and lean into the disorientation of giving up on securing the good life within colonialism, because when we accept the good life for ourselves as settlers, we condemn the global majority to death. If you are indigenous, you should lean in, because the benefits of the good life can be retracted at any time for any reason, which means they do not offer you any protection. I'm going for the critical jurisprudence link at the top. We have one, that their caretaking infrastructures are a maneuver of sustaining and instead of abolishing white supremacist institutions. Their own true far evidence says that the special new critical jurisprudence they do forces the idea of decolonization to fit into existing legal precedent, which is the inheritance of manifest destiny. Their only answer was rereading this line about we recreate legal concept, precisely our argument, and they've dropped every reason why this turns case. The idea of, quote, fluid sovereignty is the logic of the Berlin Conference, dividing the African continent. It justifies Israel encroaching on Palestinian land to commit genocide because their sovereignty is fluid anyway, which all proves the way that we think about things and look at how they're actualized. So you should not roll the dice on reform one more time, because only we have examples of how those reforms justify the sustenance and expansion of colonial institutions. The link filters are Rodriguez evidence, because they can be right that Rodriguez thinks local movements for the abolition of the state are decolonial, but he also thinks that, quote, reform is counterinsurgency. The tiebreaker is when I see crosses when they say that their abolition does not entail the end of the U.S. Their most radical imagination inverts the Red Deal's platform by talking about, quote, the ethos of the Red Deal in the plan text, which all filters the permutation as the reconciliation decided to their permutation and beats their Carlson card, because we are just simply impact turning the idea that we ought to combine these things. Now, they will clean up the offense on the ecological Indian link. The offense here is taken out by the fact that intercommunal lines between indigenous people does exist, i.e. some indigenous people use the concept of ecological caretaking to castigate other indigenous people who they might perceive as doing indigeneity wrong, because it is not a monolith. Their Leduc evidence proves our link, because they said infrastructure should be repurposed. How do you repurpose the infrastructure of things like the border, of things like border jails and ICE? This is the infrastructure that this piece of evidence is talking about, which proves our argument about how the internal debate compels us to become and work with the police, and to become the police on our own heads and the police of others. If we went a link that they should not get a permutation, then they should not get a permutation. All the crackdown arguments on the alternative are all taken out by the idea that they are the crackdown, they are the pessimistic ones, because they do not believe that a world without the United States is possible or a desirable goal. More telos of our imagination. Now, the framework debate proper, they should not be able to weigh the affirmative against, they should not be able to weigh the affirmative against any of our links, our interpretations of what I see as the invitation to the internal debate, and the negative debate choose to decline that interpretation based on their what I see scholarship and research. This durable fail is a tiebreaker here, because you cannot actualize the plan. Your ballot will not be, your ballot could never implement the sort of position that they have affirmed. It can only affirm what I see as a scholarship and research project, and the effects it has on us and the room. They implicitly agree with us when they say things like skills, but have conceded the durable fiat takes out skills, because the skills relevant to activists are things like rollback and navigating a crackdown, which are kind of deliberations that they can never assume. Their arguments about clash should all lose to the fact that we made the argument in the shoe and saying that not all clash is worth having, because clash within the framework of the internal debate between reform and not reform is exactly what makes us precisely what leads us to conclusions that another world is not possible. It's not possible. Remember, your ballot will not be the AF gets the AF, the NA gets the K. We can do both, because that incorporation sustains colonialism. They've only read arguments as to why durable fiat would allow the procedures of debate to continue, but we have impact turn those procedures continuing. So bracket the fiat implementation of the plan from your evaluation, and you should affirm it as scholarship. Case. The caretaking decided to independent negative ballot. The zeros case and prove they make structural balance inevitable if they beat the K and win that they are decolonial revolution. Then we have offense about the revolution. It's not utopia, but the reconsolidation of patriarchal colonial violence. 2 internal links. 1, remember, their Red Nation evidence says unpaid labor is, quote, indigenous excellence. Indigenous people are on a monolith, and nature communal violence is the logical outcome of a world that glorifies caretaking without consent, which how Sarah Palin is able to reconsolidate white supremacy under the frame of indigenous identity. 2, enablement. Claims the AF, quote, enables care by doing things like redistributing money that makes indigenous communities paradoxically dependent on infrastructures of violence. We only need the state paychecks to survive within colonialism, because the state makes the world colonialism, that makes life impossible, so we need to be paid under it. This is how their thought experiment project uses colonialism to justify extending itself into the future. Their arguments about framework are on case about how it's not a unique opportunity cost or the link, because the argument that black women's exploited labor is a non-unique to status quo reveals this understanding trains us to accept and perpetuate those things into the future simply because they exist now. We should not have to when a utopian world exists when their world is not utopian and not worthy of endorsement.
Okay. Features of the 2NR that you all think are noteworthy. Let's see if we agree. What would you comment on terms of this 2N. One way to think about this, what did this 2NR do that you might have had trouble doing?
The 2NR chose a very strong link that specifically and went full on that link instead of like spreading yourself out there and using color.
Okay, choice of link arguments and not choosing to extend all of the possible link arguments. This is something that I think is a really important feature to draw out in the sense that strategically, if we think about how a debate like this plays out, okay, one of the strategic advantages that comes with having one position on the part of the neg is that that position can get all of your time and a lot of depth, yeah? We saw that a lot in this debate. The negative position got a lot of depth of explanation, it got a lot deeper, we understood it really thoroughly. What is the disadvantage of that, or like what is one of the strategic costs of having invested all of that time in explaining only one larger position?
I don't know, I guess if you like lose it, you lose.
All of your eggs are in one basket, I agree with that, but we would probably be choosing to consolidate somewhat anyway. Just like, what's one of the features of a 2NR in this position? Like, what's the danger? What are a lot of 2NRs vulnerable to after having spent most of the block all on this argument? If you try to repeat every argument from the block or extend each and every link argument, it is impossible to do because you only have one, not quite a third of the time. Okay, so choice here in terms of which link arguments to go for, making sure that you have consolidated down part of the explanation, right? All of that is a reflection of the fact that you can't just kind of repeat all of the arguments. I would note that for those of you in terms of thinking about how you write blocks, how you flow and keep track of debates, right? That if we do a lot of copy pasting from the block, that is a significant danger here that we will spread ourselves out of the 2NR, right? If you are repeating huge long paragraphs from the 2NC and not consolidating or changing, like, did the 2NR sound exactly like portions of the 2NC? Were there any portions of the 2NC that were just like present in the 2NR in exactly the same way? No. Okay. Do we see how, so like the 2NR referenced, do we agree that the 2NR referenced terms and concepts that were explored in the 2NC, or like we added depth in the 2NC? Yeah? Okay? That is different than repetition. So resolution of an argument and kind of like extension of that argument in the rebuttal should sound very different than repetition. If you spend a lot of time writing out that detailed link in the 2NC, that is not a reason that you should be copy-pasting the 2NC link explanation into the 2NR. Something that I have seen with disturbing frequency, okay? Because you don't have time to explain all those arguments in the same way. You should be referencing the terms of the debate, not exactly the arguments that you made, okay? Those terms were set up in the 2NC because we now, like, when the 2NR uses a term like internal debate or hierarchy of care, right, or infrastructure link, do we know what those arguments refer to? Yeah, like we've got a very clear idea. So the 2NC gave us like all of the terms to understand. It explained them in depth. And then that meant that the 2NR wouldn't have to re-explain all of them, but instead could pick and choose how to apply, or like which of those terms are really important for trying to win. Okay? What instruction did you receive about how to go about making a decision from the 2NR?
I was told that if you're a settler, you have to be automatically skeptical about what the AF is proposing because of our predisposition.
So they made this argument about the ideology is important for constricting the way that we think. They also turned that into an offensive argument in terms of the framework arguments. They tried to get you to kind of think about that first and how you would make a decision. So they identified a starting point for making a decision. What's one of the reasons that you think that they chose that particular starting point? Why was that argument highlighted? Is that an argument that received a lot of attention from the AF? No. Okay, so part of what they're trying to do there is to say that a piece of these dense arguments that didn't get a lot of independent attention maybe has some implications for how you would read or understand the rest of them. So they tried to extract something from this much larger set of arguments to make it very important and to have that implicate where you would start and how you would start making your decision. What are some other instructions that you received about how to make your decision from the neg? Right, that language of invitation refusal, right, that's been consistent from the 1NC on. So that's also another example of like, we received a lot of information about that argument earlier in the debate, so that we have, if we were trying to make a decision using the language of invitation for refusal, would you all feel comfortable writing out like a few sentences or maybe a paragraph about like what those terms mean and why we should choose one over the other? Something like, maybe. Do we agree that the neg has tried to provide us with those details? Okay, so that's part of the like judge instruction thing is you have some of the vocabulary that you might use in explaining your decision. It's like, here's why I ought to choose refusal, or like, here's what refusal means in the context of how we are usually invited to participate in a certain framework for debate. I like that about this 2R. Any other instructions that you feel like you received? What are we,
View their arguments with scrutiny, I think.
I think that's a very good example of like, you all probably caught slightly different parts of that argument, right? The like position as a settler, extreme scrutiny, but fortunately that argument got enough detail and kind of explanation and attention that we could understand it even if we only got like a couple of the different pieces of the argument. So like that I actually think is a good example of it got enough explanation that like even if we didn't flow it exactly the same, it might still have some implications for how we would make a decision.
Bouncing off the idea that like if you're a settler, you should still vote neg because that way you're like acknowledging this like similar colonialism. They mentioned that also if you're indigenous, you should also vote neg because since the act perpetuates the idea of sort of colonial violence, then you should automatically vote negative because like the whole
We made sure not to assume that everybody's coming to this debate on the same terms or from the same spot. I agree with that.
I think the journal fiat, like the clash skills office is taking out like journal fiat. Also, it said that some of the clash is about because the clash itself isn't worth debating about.
Okay, so we got an instruction about kind of like, here's what it is to make a decision, or like the terms on which you should make a decision, these framework arguments. Those are implicated in our larger theory about the relationship between the internal debate and colonialism, right? So that remained a significant source of negative offense.
There's also something about like the ballot is an application of the affirmative as a research project, which I thought that was helpful because it's like when voting app and like affirming the YC as a good research project, which is like affirming that they use.
The neg wants you to think more broadly about kind of what the AF is telling you have the opportunity to do and why, right? So I think that that's one of the things where the neg tried to provide some larger context for how you're making your decision, or like how these arguments are, once again, interrelated, like why their framework arguments also use this language of internal debate and refusal, right? So that the alternative arguments and the framework arguments are also connected together, right? In making a decision about each part of this debate, we have some, do you see how it's like the language that we would use for deciding each part of the debate is also in the overview for how, like, the basic terms for our decision, you could trace those through all of these different pieces, yeah? Okay, I liked that feature. What do you think was most difficult about this 2NR? Some of you can probably ask Spencer and Lab, but I would like you to speculate. What would you have thought would be difficult about giving this 2NR? Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of viable spin our strategies that you can go for, so being able to, like, I guess, narrow down and pick a strategy that is helpful seems quite difficult to choose.
Yeah, like decision making here is like, because we've got so much, kind of detail and differentiation, then the decision making about which of those arguments to pick, how much time they get, all of that stuff is pretty challenging. Is the relationship between the arguments about care on the case and the larger critique, is it entirely clear how those things are connected? Like what's one of the instructions that you received about the arguments on the case? Go ahead. I agree that's a piece of instruction that we got. One of the things that I might note here is I think that this is a spot that it might, it could be difficult. Do you all feel like you have as much information about how to make a decision about the critique of hierarchies of care as you do about the critique of an internal debate? Okay, so trying to keep both of these options alive, right, there is a little bit of the cost in terms of, well, we have the instruction that one of these arguments could be considered independently, okay, but there may be, I think we have a little bit fewer, I think we have that's a little bit less fleshed out how we might go about doing that. Is there a way to make a decision in which these arguments are connected? So could your decision include arguments about both hierarchies of care and the internal debate?
Sort of, I guess, as a link, because the hierarchies of care, one of the points that Spencer made, I think it was the second subpoint on it, was that when you're still dependent on the state for the resources to reinforce these hierarchies, that's another link to the critique.
Okay, so we also have it explained as not only an independent argument. I think that was wise, because as purely an independent argument, right, there's not a ton of time that's been spent on exactly what that would look like as an argument on its own. We're just the neg is trying to make sure that their instructions don't totally separate these arguments, even if they think that you could separate them. They tried to explain how you could separate them. They didn't say that you ought to or that you have to. Right? That's something that I think is helpful. Ilan, are you about ready? Yeah. Okay, great.
One thing that I'm going to do is flow the 2AR. Many of you don't do that. Many of you are not doing that.
Very good point. Yes. If you were a 2Ed, you should absolutely flow this speech.
Okay, it's.
Oh, I'm wrong. I know I don't have to blow it, but I just, it's hard.
It's case and then the K. There's an overview on the case about the round before I get to the care stuff. Is anyone else good?
You cannot read 7 different Ks and expect 70 different ballots. The problem with the negative is that in their pursuit to make this debate as theoretical as possible, they have not extended a reason why the app is a bad idea. Look, their links are why using the state once might justify nebulously racist policies in the future, with no card that identifies what policies, what specific app, etc. Evaluate this like a dissad debate and have the same threshold for analysis. You would not vote on a politics dissad when the link is that a policy might justify people passing worse policies with no specificity when the app is reading reasons why the specific action of the plan is durably implemented by the government and is a good idea. The case page makes the K functionally unwinnable. We have uncontested offense for why the red deal facilitated through the government is good and necessary to correct genocidal violence of the status quo. Framing issues, do whatever you can to stop indigenous violence. If we win at the app alone, or combining both of our practices even 1% better, then you should vote out irrespective of the links, because we are waxing them on why the alternative does functionally nothing to prevent violence. Now, the care K, the neg has no linking, which is contextual to the form of the care that the 1AC advocates for. Their evidence is descriptive of interpersonal care under neoliberalism, but not structures of care in which indigenous peoples are forced to act as infrastructure to caretake land, the environment, and society as a result of neoliberalism. The app invests in infrastructures of care for more than human life systems, which is advocated by indigenous people and intervenes in the neoliberalism which negatively codifies care. They read 2 internal links that are both app arguments. One is unpaid labor. They are correct. Our evidence describes caretaking as indigenous excellence because indigenous people are expected to act as excellent infrastructure in the absence of a state obligation to indigenous people. The plan creates physical infrastructure which relieves Black and Native people of their expectation to care, which was the 1AR link to an argument about investing into neoliberalism. Second is
the state is with what makes colonialism, which means that it's the only mechanism with the proximity to remedying immediate impacts of colonialism. If you don't know how toxic sludge is removed from the pipes or fossil fuel sites are taken off native land in the alternative, then you should not reject actions which relieve black and native people from being made solely responsible for caring. Okay. I'm going for the permutation. The negative has not done enough work explaining why the app and the alt are mutually exclusive and why the app uniquely precludes the alternative. We have read specific evidence in the context of the app and their refusal alternative that suggests that they are compatible and it would be net beneficial to combine them. The Carlson evidence was straight dropped 2 speeches in a row. It's a carded perm card. It says the effective decolonization requires critique and political action and neither preclude each other, which takes out most of their arguments. The Rodriguez recutting might not apply to any other app except for ours because we explicitly advocate for defunding the military police and providing universal housing, all outlined in our solvency app evidence and in the 2AC caretaking good evidence. The app is an example of Rodriguez's suggestion that certain reforms can be productive if they take an abolitionist approach. Okay, we have impact on their orientation to the internal debate. The 2NC and 2NR were buzzword salad, and I'm sure most of you are confused, but I'm going to make this simple. By reading a theory of power, the negative has made the win condition for the affirmative to prove an instance of the state, or the internal debate producing good things, which is, we have more than explained. They have dropped the Lightfoot evidence that says that assuming the state is an unchanging colonial force overdetermines cooptation and underestimates the capacity of indigenous actors to strategically navigate institutions for real gains. Their thesis is simply a pessimism trap that forecloses possibilities for engagement by assuming that any interaction with the state is surrender, which eliminates key resistance strategies, which also impact turns the alternative and means the app and the permutation are net better. Zero warrant for why we become police to crack down upon the 2NR drops that clash is content neutral and they do not establish an internal link that debating about the state reforms turns into violent organizers. Neither us nor them have defended the police being good in this debate. Their internal link work is fundamentally lacking. Clash is the only thing that produces better advocates to well choreographed strategy. Every reason you think the state is bad is better combated through our model, which the 2NR concedes. They dropped that settler move to innocence is a TKO, and an internal link turns all of their judge instruction arguments. The alt and their framework arguments reject all action in favor of performative refusal. We think that is a settler move to innocence. Dropped. The Madison evidence says only material reforms by the state can change the fabric of settler societies. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It is state seizure and redistribution, which is what I gave to Judah at the bottom of the 1AR because it was so important. They turn it into a metaphor. There is no warrant for turning case. Legal precedent is good done above. They were not able to articulate what the implication of fluidity is in this debate and what their alternative conception is. The part of the card they did not read, it says that thinking on speculative registers can help to reassemble legal sovereignty constructs in response to the proposed changing landscape. No warrant for the act devolving to Israel. We never claimed people have ultimate right to stolen land, but that native sovereignty can be held by the government. None of the 2NR are specific to the app. Fluidity in the context of the app means we can improve the lives of indigenous people. Even if Rodriguez wants to abolish the state, he admits some policies would be a good idea, which I did above. The reconciliation, the age, the permutation was not explained. You should not grant it to them. There's no warrant for the ecological Indian stuff. Our evidence describing how indigenous people describe themselves. The neg is more paternalistic because they do not let indigenous people describe themselves in ways that they want to. We should not be litigating intercommunal indigenous violence, but whether or not the plan is a good idea. Finally, framework. Evaluate the material consequences of the plan and the political project of the New Deal. We're under no illusion the plan happens. We agree that it is illusory. They have dropped that fiat is good in the context of the Arctic. Legal imagination for alternative futures can help reconstruct current legal landscapes and reinforces indigenous sovereignty. That's stronger. Only we have evidence. Even the thought experience alone are sufficient. The skill stuff was done above. Impact turning clash is relevant. No matter what we clash over, it'll develop better activism. It just needs to be added to the stasis. But the framework debate is ultimately a little bit irrelevant in this debate because we've impact turned all of the links and it all went conceded.
Okay. We'll identify a couple 2AR features before we send you to lunch. The other thing that I want you to consider before going to lunch is, since it would be useful to write a ballot, I understand that you want to get some time to eat and all that kind of stuff. No matter what order you want to do things in or how thoroughly you want to sit down and make a decision, the thing that I would most recommend is writing down a few notes to yourself about the arguments that you think you need to look at in order to make a decision. Okay, so just like retain a little bit of the information that comes immediately in the aftermath of the debate. I'll even stay quiet here for a second and then we'll talk about a couple 2AR features, but just like make some notes to yourself about these are the arguments that I feel like I need to decide in order to make my decision. Okay, I want everybody to spend a few minutes writing those down.
coughing, but if we're sick, we should wear a mask, please.
Okay. Everybody written down some things that you're going to be deciding? Okay, so I want us to, before we leave for lunch, just connect a couple of those items to the 2AR. So that means I want you to think about a 2AR phrase or kind of a way that they asked you to make the decision, same way we were thinking about the 2NR, okay, that features in the notes that you made to yourself. So examples of 2AR language or kind of understand and judge instruction that made it onto your, sheet of note paper at the end.
They brought up Lightfoot means kills indigenous resistance, which means that the after or that the alters the settler move to innocence, which turns judge instruction.
Okay, so both sides now have an argument about kind of like position from which you are deciding the debate, implications that has. Both are accusing the other of a concession. We might have to do some resolution there, right? But you've got at least a point of reference for thinking about that that's different. I would put that as the 2AR didn't just, the 2AR tried to use the fact that even though they didn't have a ton of arguments referenced, like you all were like, I asked the question, does the AF have a ton of response about this, position of the settler style argument? AF tried to apply a different way of thinking about that position. Yeah? So I think that's a helpful example of the AF didn't just kind of give up in that area. They tried to reference a different way of thinking about that similar category of argument. What are some other phrases or concepts that made it onto your notes? Okay, so we've got arguments about the role of fiat or political imagination and reference to 1AC evidence about it, right? The 1AC read some cards about this. The AF and the NEG have been referencing a bunch of that speculative jurisprudence stuff a little bit differently is the way that I might put it, but everybody has an argument now about the role that fiat plays in our thinking about the internal debate and what the connections are between those things. Solomon. I'm sick and I'm coughing because I poorly swallowed my tea. Sorry. That was a very good point, which is the AF tried to set the kind of a threshold for a way of making a decision about once again, this is phrased in terms of the implication of the link argument rather than the link itself. This wasn't state yes, no, this was desirability of state yay or nay and what the threshold ought to be for determining that. Are you pointed towards some evidence that might help you make that determination by the AF? So is the AF thinking about their cards in that area? What did people write down for that? What cards would you go if you were trying to resolve this argument about? So if the threshold is set in that way, what cards are you going to go look at to make that determination? Okay, so Carlson is one site that we have extended with the permutation, right? That's looped into this debate about refusal in the state, yeah? Anybody else write down some others?
The Rodriguez part was talking about how some
Rodriguez, so threshold, I would say is a little bit different, kind of categorically, is the internal debate truly as categorical as suggested? Are there examples of reform that might be abolitionist? Yep, that's one place that I would go checking too. Okay, Lightfoot on kind of how to think about resistance and state, refusal and state. I agree that that's another. So do we see how the AF has clearly pointed you in some directions? Have both sides provided you with evidence that you would be looking at in order to make the overall determination about kind of the strength of their argument? Do we feel like we have a confident set of things that we're going to go looking for? Okay, so are we going to read the entire doc from both the AF and the NEG? No. You have received instructions about what to prioritize in terms of which evidence we would look at, how to begin to resolve that. Okay, we will make the evidence available in your lab Slack so you can take a look at it over lunch. Thank you for paying good attention through there. We have lab at 1:30.